Before we begin tonight's story, I did love for you to take a moment to support the channels. If you enjoy relaxing history like this, please give the video a like and subscribe so you will always have a new story ready when you need to unwind. I did also love to know where in the world are you listening from tonight. Drop it in the comments below. It is always wonderful to see how far these sleepy journeys travel. Close your eyes for a moment and let your mind drift back more than 300 years to the dawn of the 18th century. The air smells faintly of smoke from kitchen fires. Silk robes whisper as court officials move through marble corridors. Bells chime softly in the distance from a Buddhist temple, and far beyond, the steady rumble of ocean waves breaks against the southern coast of a land so powerful, so self-assured. It believed itself to be the very center of the world. China. In 1700, the Qing Dynasty was at its height. The emperors of the Qings, descended from Manchu warriors who had swept down from the north, ruled over a population of more than 300 million souls, far more than any European kingdom of the times. The empire's land stretched across deserts, mountains, jungles and plains, a patchwork of climates and cultures all bound under the dragon banner. Travelers who journeyed here often felt as if they had stepped into another age. In London or Paris, streets were noisy, narrow, and filled with soot. But in Beijing, avenues stretched broad and orderly, lined with willow trees and lacquered gates. The forbidden city rose in careful harmony, red walls and golden roofs gleaming beneath the sun. Economically, China was the beating heart of the world. Historians estimate that around 1/3 of all goods produced on Earth came from within its borders. Think of that. Out of every 3 cups, or bolts of cloth, or crafted items in the world, one was made in China. Porcelain that seemed as fragile as ice, yet strong enough to endure generations, poured out of workshops in Qing Dynasty. Silks, woven so fine it could slip through a ring, dazzled courts from Moscow to Madrid. And above all, tea, those delicate dried leaves that grew in misty mountain terraces, was slowly transforming into the most desired beverage on Earth. Yet for all its wealth, China had little interest in what others produced. The Qing court looked upon foreign goods with mild curiosity at best, disdain at worst. European clocks and mechanical toys occasionally amused the emperor, but as novelties, not necessities. The sentiment could be summed up in a single thought: we already have everything we need. When emissaries came from abroad, they were required to perform the ritual of the kowtow, bowing low before the emperor as a recognition of his supremacy. To the Qing rulers, foreign kings were not equals but distant vassals, barbarians whose only proper role was to offer tribute to the Middle Kingdom. The West, meanwhile, was enthralled. From the palaces of St. Petersburg to the tea houses of London, Chinese goods became the mark of refinement. A lady sipping tea from a porcelain cup in England might not realize that the leaves in her pot had traveled for months across stormy seas, purchased at great expense from merchants in Canton. But she knew one thing: that owning and consuming Chinese products marked her as sophisticated, worldly, and fashionable. This obsession grew into what some called chinoiserie, an entire craze for all things Chinese. Furniture, wallpaper, clothing, even gardens were remade in imitation of the empire's elegance. The trade, however, was deeply lopsided. European merchants clamored for more tea, more silk, more porcelain, and the Chinese, politely but firmly, asked for payment only in silver. Silver coins, bullion bars, and ingots poured into China like rivers, filling vaults and treasuries. For the Qings, it was a steady flow of wealth. For Europeans, it was a growing headache. Nations like Britain and Spain had once prided themselves on their vast silver reserves, mined from colonies in the Americas. But by the late 1700s, much of that silver was flowing eastward, vanishing into Chinese coffers with little coming back in return. Imagine the frustration of a British merchant. He could buy Chinese goods, certainly, and sell them at a profit back home. But to do so, he had to bring enormous amounts of silver, and that constant drain was threatening the treasury of his nations. What could he sell to China that the empire actually wanted? European wool. The Chinese had their own textiles, finer and more comfortable. Glassware. Porcelain was superior. Weapons. The Chinese manufactured their own. Time and again, proposals were rejected, leaving Western traders in the same predicament, pay in silver or not at all. And yet, from China's perspective, there was no reason to worry. The empire appeared serene, stable, and unshakable. Within its borders, the emperor ruled with the mandate of heavens, supported by layers of bureaucracy that stretched from the capital all the way down to the smallest villages. Scholar officials trained in the classics administered laws and taxes. Farmers tilled the fields, supplying rice and wheat in vast abundance. Markets bustled with trade, not only within the empire, but also with neighboring regions across Central Asia and Southeast Asia. Life for most was hard and simple, but secure in the knowledge that their empire stood unchallenged. Of course, no empire is ever truly unmovable. Beneath the confidence of the Qing court, changes were beginning to stir, subtle, almost invisible at first. A population boom strained resources. Corruption crept into bureaucracies. Local rebellions occasionally flared up, only to be suppressed, but leaving faint scars behind. These were cracks so small they could be ignored, or dismissed as the natural troubles of any great realms. No one could yet imagine that something as simple, as unassuming, as a flowering plant would widen those cracks into deep fractures. That plant was the poppy. From its bulb, a resin could be harvested. Opium. Used in small amounts, it was medicine, a balm for pains, a sleep aid, a cure for coughs. China had known it for centuries, but in the hands of foreign merchants, eager to balance their books and unwilling to bow forever to China's demands, opium would become something else entirely. It would become the lever by which the West pried open the Middle Kingdom. But that is a story for later chapters. For now, picture the dragon still sleeping, coiled in its palace halls, surrounded by mountains of silver and silken treasures. Outside, on the waves of the South China Sea, foreign ships linger with curiosity, their captains whispering about opportunities. And on distant fields in India, poppy flowers sway in the wind, their crimson petals hiding the seeds of empire, shattering chains. For the Qing emperors, there was no reason to doubt the future. For the rest of the world, there was no way yet to imagine what was coming. The balance of power seemed eternal. But in history, nothing ever stays still for long. And so, with the dragon resting and the poppies blooming, our tale begins. The year is around 1800. The first pale light of dawn glimmers over the southern coast of China, and the city of Canton, today's Guangzhou, awakens to the sounds of commerce. Imagine yourself there, stirring from uneasy sleep on a narrow wooden bed in a rented room not far from the waterfront. The mattress beneath you is thin, little more than a mat, and your back aches from the hard platform beneath. Humid air presses against your skin, even at this early hour, carrying with it the scents of salt water, spices, smoke, and the faint tang of human sweat that drifts in from the crowded streets below. As you open your eyes, the muffled roar of a city already alive seeps through the shutters. Merchants calling in sing-song voices. The rhythmic creak of ship, masts swaying against their moorings, the steady clang of iron on wood as dock workers begin their days. Canton is unlike any other city in the empire. It is China's single window to the outside world, the only port through which foreigners are allowed to trade. For you, and for every Western merchant here, this bustling harbour is the keyhole through which you glimpse the treasures of the Middle Kingdom. Stepping outside, the morning air thickens with noise. Thousands of people jostle through narrow lanes. Chinese traders in flowing robes of cotton or silk, porters bent double beneath loads of porcelain, sailors with rough hands and sunburnt faces hauling crates toward the docks. The smells intensify, dried fish frying oil, bundles of tea leaves carried in great wicker baskets. The city hums like a living engine, each movement part of an intricate dance of commerce. Yet there is order too, because trade in Canton is carefully regulated. It's designed not for the convenience of foreign visitors, but for the protection of Chinese interests. Foreigners here are confined to a special district outside the city walls, known as the factories. The name is misleading. These are not workshops filled with machines, but rows of trading houses, each flying the flag of the nation it represents. The British have their factory, the Dutch theirs, and the Americans, newly arrived in the wake of independence, maintain a smaller presence. No foreigner may travel freely into the vast lands beyond Canton. They may not bring their wives or families, nor may they learn the Chinese language in any official capacities. They live here like guests kept in the antechamber of a great palace, tolerated but never embraced. The system is designed with deliberate limits. Foreign merchants may only conduct business through approved Chinese intermediaries known as Hong merchants. These men, licensed by the emperor himself, hold enormous power. They alone may buy and sell to the Westerners, acting as both gatekeepers and guarantors of trade. The rules are strict, but they have created something remarkable, a flow of silver into China so steady that fortunes beyond imagination are built upon it. Among these Hong merchants, one name towers above all others: Hao. His wealth is the stuff of legend, whispered about in awe among foreigners and locals alike. By some estimates, his fortune exceeds that of any man alive at the time. Imagine vast storerooms filled with shining ingots, stacks of silver coins piled high enough to tumble like waterfalls when calamity strikes. During a fire in 1822, eyewitnesses reported rivers of molten silver running through the streets as his vaults gave way to the flames. Yet even disasters could not ruin him. He rebuilt, he traded, and he grew richer still. This morning, down at the docks, you spot him. Draped in elegant silk robes, he stands with hands clasped behind his back, directing an army of clerks and assistants. British East India Company ships unload their cargoes under his watchful eye, crates stacked with silver, brought from halfway across the world. In exchange, bales of silk, barrels of porcelain, and above all, casks of tea are prepared for the return voyage. The balance is clear. Foreigners bring silver. The Chinese provide goods. For now, both sides profit, though in very different ways. For England, tea has become more than a luxury, it is an obsession. No breakfast in London feels complete without it. No polite conversation flows without cups steaming on the table. Demand is insatiable, and the only source is here, in China. But as you watch the British merchants, you notice something uneasy in their expressions. They glance at their half-empty coffers, calculating how much longer they can afford to ship silver eastwards. England is running out of the bloody stuff. One mutters under his breath. It is a truth that gnaws at every trader present this system. So lucrative for China is bleeding the West dry. And so even amid the bustle of Canton's harbour, beneath the booming trade and glittering fortunes, a question hangs in the humid air. What can we sell to China? For years, the answer has been nothing. Every attempt has failed. Wool, glassware, even weapons, all dismissed. The emperor's officials shake their heads politely. We have no need. The city itself reflects this imbalance. Within the foreign factories, Western merchants dine on imported bread, salted meats, and the occasional bottle of wine carried across oceans. Outside, in the labyrinth of Chinese streets, locals feast on fresh noodles, vegetables, and steaming dumplings from street vendors. Both worlds exist side by side, but never fully mingle. The foreigners are perpetual outsiders, their presence tolerated only so long as silver continues to flow. Yet Canton, for all its restrictions, is alive with energy. A place where languages and faces from across the globe collide. Indian sailors chant as they haul ropes. Portuguese traders bargain in accented Chinese. American captains smoke long pipes as they await their turn at the docks. At nights, lanterns glow along the riverfront, music drifts from teahouses, and the air smells faintly of sandalwood and incense. For a foreigner, it is intoxicating, strange, exotic, and filled with opportunities just out of reach. Still, as the day wears on, you sense the tension beneath the surface. The Chinese system is strict, confident, and immovable. The Western merchants are restless, calculating, and increasingly desperate. The two worlds brush shoulders here in Canton, but neither truly understands the other. And somewhere beyond the horizon on fields of Bengal, a solution is already blooming, a crop that will slip quietly into this carefully balanced system, tipping it into chaos. For now, though, Canton thrives, the dragon's southern gateway brimming with silver and tea. Dawn has broken, the harbour roars with life, and the day's trade begins anew. But history has already set its course. The smoke has not yet risen, but the seeds are planted, and soon they will take root. The sun has climbed higher over Canton's bustling harbour. By now, the shouts of dockworkers echo across the water like a steady chorus, and the creak of wooden ships mixes with the cries of hawkers selling steamed buns and hot tea to tired labourers. The foreign factories stand in neat rows, their flags fluttering faintly in the humid breeze. Within them, ledgers are opened, calculations made, and agreements signed. And behind nearly every contract, nearly every deal struck between foreign traders and the Middle Kingdoms, lies one simple truth: silver. Silver is the lifeblood of this trade. It flows into China with every transaction, pouring into the coffers of the Hong merchants and beyond, into the treasuries of the Qing Empire itself. To understand the story of opium, you must first understand this river of precious metal, for it was the hunger to stem its flow that drove the West to desperate measures. Imagine the scene: a British East India Company ship has just arrived from London after a voyage lasting months, through storms, doldrums, and treacherous seas. It carries woolen cloth, glassware, and manufactured goods, but none of these are destined for Chinese markets. They will sit untouched in the ship's hold, or be traded later among other foreigners. The true cargo that matters, the one that buys tea and porcelain, lies in locked chests, silver. Men groan as they haul the heavy crates onto the docks, each chest weighing hundreds of pounds. When pried open, they reveal stacks of gleaming coins, often Spanish dollars, prized for their reliable weight and purity. Others contain silver ingots, shining bars stamped with marks of authenticity. From the docks, these treasures are carried under guard to the factories, then onward into the hands of the Hong merchants, who ensure their transfer into the Chinese economy. The process is methodical, almost ritualistic. For the foreigner, it is a painful necessity. Every chest unloaded is another dent in his nation's treasury, another reminder of the imbalance that cannot be sustained forever. But for the Chinese merchants, it is triumph. The river of silver seems endless, each transaction swelling their fortunes, each season of trade another step toward unimaginable wealth. No one embodied this prosperity more than Hauqua. His name was spoken with awe not only in Canton, but in London, New York, and Calcutta. To the foreigners, he was both a partner and a mystery, immensely wealthy, unfailingly polite, yet shrewd beyond measure. His house, it was said, contained halls lined with porcelain vases taller than a man, paintings in gold frames, and silken draperies that glowed in candlelight. Servants hurried through his courtyards, tending to gardens where carp swam in clear pools. But beyond the elegance lay something more impressive still: vaults filled with silver. During the Great Fire of 1822, when flames devoured whole sections of Cantons, witnesses claimed to see molten rivers of silver running through the streets as Hauqua's stores melted in the heat. The image became legend. Silver flowing like water, wealth so vast it seemed part of the natural landscapes. Yet even that disaster could not topple him. He rebuilt swiftly, his fortune so deep, rooted it could withstand almost anything. For the foreign merchants, dealing with Hauqua was both a privilege and a challenge. He was reliable, yes. Contracts honored, debts settled. But he was no fool. He understood the desperation behind their eyes, the way their ledgers bled red ink with each shipment of silver eastward. He set his prices accordingly. ensuring that while foreigners profited back home from selling tea and porcelain, it was China, through men like him, that claimed the lion's share of wealth, and so the river widened. By the late 18th century, Britain alone was importing millions of pounds of Chinese tea each year. Every ship that sailed homeward carried its hull crammed with chests of the fragrant leaves, porcelain stacked carefully to survive the voyage, and bolts of silk tucked between. In return, China accepted little but silver, and the West obliged, straining their reserves in the process. Back in Europe, voices of concern grew louder. Economists warned of dwindling supplies. Politicians fretted that silver reserves were draining away into an empire that gave little in return. It was not simply an inconvenience, it was a threat to financial stability, a slow bleeding that might weaken nations if left unchecked. And yet, as long as the British people demanded their tea, as long as European households decorated themselves with Chinese porcelain and silks, the trade continued. Here in Canton, however, the imbalance felt like triumphs. Walk through the markets near the harbour, and you would see the signs of prosperity. Everywhere merchants in embroidered robes, their sleeves lined with delicate silk, houses adorned with lacquer and golds, banquet halls where roasted duck and fine wine were served to guests beneath carved wooden beams. For the Qing courts, news of the silver inflow was welcome confirmation that the empire remained the center of the world. What need had they of foreign trinkets when the foreigners themselves seemed so willing to pay in treasure? And yet, the river of silver was not infinite. Beneath the wealth lay an uncomfortable truth: Europe could not continue forever to bleed silver eastwards. The balance was unsustainable, and the search for an answer grew urgent. Somewhere, somehow, they needed a product that the Chinese would accept. Not just accept, but crave, desire, even depend upon. In the meantime, the river continued its course, gleaming in the sun as coins changed hands, as ships departed lighter in silver but heavier in tea. For now, the system held a delicate balance of desire and payment, supply and demand. But like any river, this one would eventually carve new channels, erode old banks, and reshape the landscape through which it flowed. Hauqua, standing on the docks with his hands clasped behind his back, may not have known the full scale of the future. Yet perhaps he sensed it, in the way foreign eyes lingered too long on the silver, in the way they whispered among themselves of deficits and debts. Perhaps he understood that no river runs forever without change. For the moment, though Canton thrived, ships came and went, silver poured in, and tea, silk, and porcelain flowed outwards. The dragon still slept, its coffers overflowing, while in the distance, in fields far away in Bengal, the first whispers of an answer to the silver problem swayed gently in the wind. Fields of poppies, their petals crimson beneath the suns. It is late afternoon in London, sometime in the late 18th century. The sky is grey, as it often is, and a light drizzle falls over cobblestone streets. Carriages rattle past, wheels splashing through puddles, while pedestrians hurry beneath umbrellas and cloaks. Inside homes and taverns, however, a quiet ritual is taking place. Teapots are being warmed, porcelain cups set upon tables, and steaming liquid poured with deliberate care. Tea, once a rare curiosity in Europe, has by now become a necessity. Imagine a lady in an elegant drawing room, her gown rustling as she leans forward to sip delicately from a cup of blue and white porcelain imported from Qing Dynasty. Or picture a factory worker, exhausted after a long shift in the smoky mills of Manchester, finding comfort in a cheap but hot cup of tea brewed from the same leaves, sweetened with sugar. From the palaces of kings to the humble cottages of labourers, tea has woven itself into the fabric of daily life. This was not always so. In the 17th century, tea arrived in Europe as an exotic luxury, sipped by aristocrats more for novelty than need. But as decades passed, something changed. The taste was light yet invigorating, comforting yet stimulating. Unlike ale or wines, it sharpened rather than dulled the mind. Unlike coffee, it was gentler, less bitter, easier to pair with meals. Slowly but surely, it spreads. By the 18th century, it was no longer a curiosity, but an obsession. In England especially, tea drinking became a cultural cornerstone. Breakfast without tea was unthinkable. Afternoon gatherings revolved around it, with dainty cakes and sandwiches to accompany the steaming cups. The East India Company, recognizing this appetite, shipped millions of pounds of tea from Canton each year. What had once been a delicacy became a staple, and with that shift, demand soared to heights no one could have predicted. But there was a cost. Every cup of tea poured in London, every porcelain saucer lifted in Edinburgh or Dublin, was tied by invisible strings to the distant harbours of southern China. The leaves that flavoured the water were paid for not with wool or manufactured goods, but with silver. Each sip represented a coin that had crossed oceans, drained from European treasuries, and deposited into the coffers of the Qing Empire. The imbalance was staggering. By the mid-1700s, Britain was importing millions of pounds of tea annually, and the outflow of silver to China was so vast that it alarmed Parliament and financiers alike. Some estimates suggest that as much as 1/10 of Britain's silver reserves vanished into this trade. Imagine chests of gleaming coins disappearing into the hulls of ships, never to return, carried eastward in exchange for leaves that would be boiled and drunk within weeks. Still, no one could stop it. Tea had become more than a beverage. It was a social ritual, a marker of identity, a quiet comfort in an age of rapid change. Industrialization was reshaping cities, drawing thousands into factories filled with noise and smoke. Urban life was harsh, hours long, wages low, but tea offered warmth, a brief respite, a small luxury within reach of even the poor. Sweetened with sugar from Caribbean plantations, and accompanied by bread or biscuits, it sustained workers through the grueling days of industrial labor. For the wealthy, tea was equally indispensable. Elaborate tea services, fine porcelain cups, and ornate silver spoons became symbols of status. To host an afternoon tea was to display refinements. To possess imported porcelain was to show connection to global trade. Even the design of English gardens reflected the craze, with pavilions and furniture built in imitation of Chinese styles, inspired by the land that provided the leaves. The East India Company grew rich from this obsession, its ships sailing in constant rotation between London and Canton. Yet within the company's offices, concern deepened. The profit from selling tea at home was immense. Yes, but the constant drain of silver was bleeding the empire's treasury dry. Each new shipment required fresh outlays of bullions, and there seemed no end to the cycle. Demand only grew, while the Chinese continued to refuse foreign goods. In taverns and coffee houses across London, debates flared. Why should Britain depend so heavily on a foreign empire? Why should its wealth slip away into the vaults of men like Hokwa? But though the grumbling grew, few could imagine abandoning tea. To suggest such a thing was almost unthinkable, like asking the English to forego bread or beer. Tea was no longer foreign. It was English now, woven into the national character. And so, ships continued to sail, silver continued to flow, and the tea habit deepened with each passing year. Children grew up with it, workers relied on it, and merchants profited from it. The ritual of boiling water, pouring leaves, and savouring the steam became a rhythm as steady as the tolling of church bells. Meanwhile, across the oceans, in the bustling lanes of Canton, Chinese officials watched with calm detachment. To them, the foreigner's obsession was amusing but unremarkable. So long as silver poured in, the system suited the empire well. Tea plantations expanded, porcelain kilns worked day and night, silk spinners wove their threads. The dragon seemed to grow only stronger, its wealth swelling as the West indulged in its daily rituals. Yet beneath the surface, a storm was gathering. The British appetite for tea was insatiable, but their reserves of silver were finite. Something had to give. The search for a solution grew more urgent, whispered in the halls of the East India Company, debated in parliaments, and pondered by merchants in the factories of Canton. What could possibly balance this trade? What could the West sell that China would buy with equal fervor? The answer, as history would show, was not a manufactured goods, nor a precious metal, nor an invention of science. It was something far more dangerous, something that promised pleasure, but carried destructions. For while the English sipped their tea in contentment, in Bengal fields under British rule, a different crop swayed in the breeze, the poppy, its bulbs heavy with resin, its petals blood, red beneath the sun. For now, however, London carried on with its ritual. Teapot steamed, cups clinked, and the obsession deepened. Few could imagine that this simple habit, this soothing daily comfort, would one day drive nations to war and bring an empire of centuries to its knees. Picture a chest of silver coins, heavy, gleaming, each stamped with the mark of a kingdom. Now imagine dozens of such chests, stacked in the dim hold of a ship. Lantern light flickers against the polished surfaces as sailors secure the cargo for the long voyage east. These are not treasures taken in conquest, nor gifts offered in diplomacy. They are payment for tea, silk, and porcelain. For nearly a century, this was the rhythm of Britain's trade with China. Tea flowed west, silver flowed east. Year after year, ship after ship, coin after coin. In London, the East India Company auctioned Chinese tea to eager buyers, reaping enormous profits from a society that had grown utterly dependent on the drink. But before a single leaf could reach British shores, silver had to be handed over in Canton. The sums were staggering. By the late 1700s, millions of pounds worth of silver left Britain each year. Some estimates suggest that as much as 1/10 of the nation's supply drained into China, swallowed by a trade system that gave nothing back. Woolen cloth, iron goods, and machinery, these the British offered, but Chinese merchants and officials declined with polite firmness. We already have all we need. The emperor himself was rumored to have said, "Your country manufactures nothing that we desire." The imbalance gnawed at British leaders. To their eyes, silver was not merely money. It was the lifeblood of empire, the foundation of armies, fleets, and commerce. Every chest shipped to Canton was a chest not available for other ventures, a weakening of financial strengths. In the counting houses of London and the halls of Parliament, worry deepened. Could a nation truly remain powerful if its wealth vanished eastward in such torrents? Meanwhile, within Britain itself, ordinary people gave little thought to this imbalance. They sipped their tea, sweetened with sugar, often unaware that each cup carried with it the weight of lost treasure. A factory worker in Manchester, warming her hands around a steaming mug, could not imagine that her comfort was linked to the anxious debates of statesmen. A gentleman hosting an afternoon tea in Bath might comment on the flavour of a new blend, but rarely on the coins it cost his country. In Canton, the flow of silver was noticed with satisfaction. The Hong merchants grew rich, their coffers swelling as they mediated between British traders and the imperial treasury. For them, the trade was simple and profitable. Goods out, silver in. The system was tightly controlled, and it worked entirely to China's advantage, yet across the seas. The British began to search desperately for a remedy. If silver was draining too quickly, perhaps another commodity could be substituted. But what? Woolens were rejected. Iron tools found no buyers. Manufactured goods held no appeal. The Chinese markets remained closed, their preferences unchanged. And so the imbalance grew. The problem was not Britain's alone. Other European nations also drank Chinese teas, bought Chinese silk, admired Chinese porcelain. All sent silver in return, and all found themselves weakened. But Britain, as the greatest consumer of tea, felt the pinch most acutely. The drain of bullion was like a slow bleed, invisible day to day but deadly over time. Consider how strange this was in a world dominated by European power. In India, Britain could dictate terms, extracting resources and levying taxes. In the Caribbean, it could shape economies around sugar plantations. But in China, the script was reversed. Here, the West had no leverage. Here, it was the foreigners who bowed, who begged, who paid in precious metal for the right to carry away goods. The irony was bitter. An empire that spanned oceans, whose navy patrolled the seas, whose merchants reached every corner of the globe, reduced to supplicants at the gates of Canton, handing over silver in exchange for leaves to brew in hot water. In the halls of the East India Company, the frustration grew unbearable. Meetings stretched long into the night, directors arguing over ledgers that showed profits at home, but losses abroad. "We must find something," they insisted. Some article of trade that the Chinese will accept. It was not merely an economic question. It was a matter of pride, of national strength, of imperial survival. Silver, once abundant, began to feel scarce. Each shipment east represented not only wealth lost but opportunity denied. Investments delayed, wars harder to fund, credit strains. Economists warned of long-term decline if the imbalance could not be corrected. The phrase, "the silver drain," began to appear in reports, capturing the sense of slow, steady erosion. And so attention turned to other commodities. Cotton from India, too coarse for Chinese tastes, manufactured goods from Britain, dismissed as unnecessary, foodstuffs. The empire was self-sufficient. The list of rejections grew, each attempt ending in failure. It seemed there was no key to unlock the Chinese market, no product to balance the flow. But in Bengal, under British control, a possibility stirred. There, fields of poppies swayed in the warm sun. Their bulbs, when cut, oozed a resin long known for its narcotic power, opium. For centuries it had been used in small quantities as medicines, but also as a substance of leisure smoked in pipes to induce dreamlike calm. Chinese elites had experimented with it before, but demand was limited, restricted by imperial bans. What if, company officials whispered, this crop could be turned into a trade goods? What if the same appetite that made Europeans crave tea could be cultivated in China for opium? The thought was daring, dangerous, but increasingly irresistible. For now, though, the drain continued. Silver coins clinked into scales in Canton warehouses. Ships sailed heavy with treasure, returning light with tea and porcelain. And in Britain, the nation that prided itself on mastery of trades, a deep unease grew. Something had to change. The drain could not go on forever. And so the poppies of Bengal waited. Their red petals shimmered in the sunlight, their hidden resin gleaming like a promise. Soon, they would offer an answer that would transform not only the balance of trade, but the fate of empires. Close your eyes and picture a field at dawn. The air is heavy with mists, the soil dark and damp beneath rows of plants swaying gently in the breeze. Each plant rises on a tall green stalk, crowned with a delicate flower of pale pink or deep red. Dew glitters on the petals as the first sunlight breaks across the horizons. But it is not the beauty of the flower that has drawn men here for centuries. It is what lies hidden within the bulb at its center, the milky sap of the poppy. This is Bengal at the turn of the 19th century, one of the richest agricultural regions under British control. Once known for rice, sugar, and indigo, its fields now bear a different crops, opium poppies. To the untrained eye, the plants might seem harmless, even lovely, but for those who work them, the truth is clear. Each bulb contains power. Each drop of sap can soothe pain, bring sleep, or plunge the human spirit into dreamy oblivions. The process is almost ritual. Farmers walk the fields with sharp blades, making shallow cuts into the green pods. By evenings, a sticky white resin oozes out, exposed to the air. By morning, it has darkened to a rich brown gum. With careful hands, the farmers scrape it off and press it into small lumps. These are gathered, packed, and sent to warehouses where British agents inspect them. From there, the opium is pressed into cakes, sealed in chests, and loaded onto waiting ships. At first, the trade seems modest, even manageable. The Chinese have long known opium, using it in tinctures to dull pain or ease sleeplessness. Smoked, however, it has a different effect, one that Europeans have learned to cultivate. A few puffs on a pipe can blur the edges of worry. A few more can lift the body into dreamlike floating. It is an escape, a release, a luxury of the wealthy. And because the Chinese imperial court has banned it, it carries an allure of danger. To the merchants of the East India Company, opium appears almost miraculous. Here at last is a commodity the Chinese desire, so much so that they will part with their precious silver to obtain it. Instead of bullion flowing east in endless streams, the flow begins to reverse. Chests of opium leave Bengal, and in return, silver begins to trickle back west. For company directors staring at their ledgers in London, this is salvation. For the British Empire, it is an opportunity. Yet in the fields of Bengal, the story is less triumphant. Farmers do not always choose to grow poppies. Many are coerced, forced by company contracts to abandon food crops in favor of opium. Inspectors demand quotas, and penalties fall heavy on those who fail. Villages that once thrived on rice or wheat find themselves trapped in debt. Their bellies empty even as warehouses fill with drugs. Hunger spreads quietly, hidden beneath the balance sheets of empire. Still, the poppy spreads. By the early 1800s, Bengal produces thousands of chests of opium each year, each chest weighing over 100 pounds. Ships carry them out into the Bay of Bengal, past Calcutta through the Strait of Malacca, and finally up the South China Sea to Canton. The trade is officially illegal under Chinese laws, but loopholes abound. Foreign merchants anchor offshore, transferring their cargo at night to small boats that slip quietly to the coasts. From there, the opium flows inland through networks of smugglers, bribed officials, and eager customers. In Canton itself, whispers grow. A shadow trade begins to thrive beneath the glittering surface of legitimate commerce. At night, small lanterns flicker in hidden rooms where wealthy men recline on wooden platforms. The air is thick with smoke, sweet and acrid. Pipes are lit, dreams inhaled. Officials, merchants, scholars all begin to taste the new indulgence. At first, it seems a harmless diversion. It's no more dangerous than wine, but the effects are insidious. Tolerance grows, cravings deepen. Soon, some cannot pass a single day without the pipe. The imperial court is alarmed. Edicts are issued, prohibiting the import and use of opium. But the bans are difficult to enforce. Corruption seeps into the system like water through cracks. Customs officials accept bribes. Soldiers look the other way, and local magistrates find reasons to delay punishments. The very wealth of the trade makes it impossible to suppress, and so despite imperial warnings, the demand only increases. Back in Britain, tea continues to pour in, its cost now balanced not by silver, but by the suffering of others. Ordinary Britons sip their morning cups unaware that the drink has been paid for with fields of poppies in Bengal and pipes of smoke in Canton. The imbalance of trade appears solved, but at what cost? Few pause to ask. The irony is sharp. In trying to cure the wound of the silver drains, Britain has opened a deeper wound in another land. The solution that saved its treasury is a poison for China. The merchants, of course, see only profit. The company men write proudly of balanced ledgers, their voices echoing in boardrooms far from the fields of Bengal or the smoke-filled rooms of Canton. Yet beneath it all, the seeds of disaster are sown. Addiction spreads like a slow fire. Once confined to the wealthy, it trickles down to scholars, clerks, artisans, soldiers. A society that once prided itself on discipline and tradition begins to weaken under the haze of the pipes. What began as a clever trade strategy will soon swell into a catastrophe. But for now, in these early decades of the 19th century, the poppy blooms. Its petals open with the sun, its resin collected with practiced hands. Ships wait in harbours, silver begins to flow westwards, and the British congratulate themselves on a problem solved. In the quiet hours before dawn, however, the farmers of Bengal know a different truth. They bend over their fields, cutting the pods again and again, their stomachs hollow, their debts deep. The empire has found its solution, but it has done so by planting a dangerous flower. And in the tea houses of Canton, as smoke curls toward the ceiling, the first outlines of a coming storm begin to form. Night falls over the Pearl River Delta. The last rays of the sun fade into the South China Sea, and the bustling daytime chaos of Canton Harbour begins to settle. Ships creak gently at anchor, their sails furled, their decks quiet under a canopy of stars. By day, this is the most controlled trading port in the world, a place where rules are rigid, transactions precise, and foreigners kept firmly in line. By night, however, another world awakens. A faint splash breaks the silence. Small wooden boats slip out from hidden inlets, their oars muffled with cloth to prevent sound. Lanterns are hooded to cast only the faintest glow. Each boat rows toward a larger ship anchored beyond the reach of official patrols. No flags fly from her masts, no cargo is listed in the imperial registers. She is a country ship, a vessel that belongs to neither official trade nor imperial sanction. Her cargo opiums. The operation is practiced and smooth. Ropes are lowered, crates hauled up, coins exchanged in hushed voices. Within an hour, the small boats turn back toward the Chinese coast, their holds now heavy with contraband. On shore, smugglers wait to take possessions, blending the crates into caravans of ordinary goods. By morning, the opium will be moving inland, hidden among shipments of tea, cloth, and salts. This is the shadow network that makes the trade possible. Officially, China forbids the import of opiums. Edicts from the emperor declare it illegal, immoral, destructive to the health of the people. Punishments for smugglers are severe, and yet the trade flourishes. Why? Because profit outweighs fear. The margins are staggering. A chest of opium bought cheaply in Bengal can be sold in Canton for 10 times its value. Fortunes are made in a single voyage. Smugglers are not the only ones to benefit. Corruption spreads through the ranks of Chinese officials. A customs inspector, charged with keeping foreign merchants in check, accepts a discreet pouch of silver and looks the other way. A local magistrate, underpaid by the imperial treasury, receives gifts to overlook certain suspicious caravans. Even some military officers, sworn to defend the empire, are bribed to ensure their patrols never seem to be in the right place at the right time. Among the most active players are the private British merchants, men not officially part of the East India Company, but eager to profit from its oversight. They operate in the grey zones of empires, using fast ships to run opium along the Chinese coast. Known as country traders, they are ruthless, daring, and often immensely wealthy. Some make their reputations smuggling opium, others build dynasties that will one day shape global finance. Their names, Jardine, Matheson's, Dent, will echo in history, but here in the early 1800s, they are simply opportunists, men who see a fortune where others see only risks. Inside Canton itself, secret dens multiply. By day, the city bustles with legitimate commerce. Tea houses filled with chatter, warehouses stacked with porcelain, markets overflowing with silk. By night, behind heavy doors and shuttered windows, the smoke curls upwards. Merchants recline on wooden benches, officials sink into cushions, and young scholars exchange nervous glances as attendants prepare the pipes. The ritual is delicate: a pellet of opium heated, placed into the bowl, the pipe lit, and the smoke drawn in with slow, practiced breaths. The effect is instant, intoxicating, dreamlike. At first, the trade caters to the wealthy. To smoke opium is to signal leisure, sophistications, the ability to afford what is forbidden. But as the supply grows, prices fall, and the drug trickles down into broader society. Servants, artisans, even soldiers find ways to buy small amounts. The dens grow crowded, the smoke thicker, the demand insatiable. What began as a luxury now spreads like ink through paper, seeping into every corner of the empire. In London and Calcutta, company officials pretend ignorance. The East India Company itself does not directly sell opium in China. Instead, it auctions the product in India to private traders. The merchants carry it north, sell it at sea, and somehow, mysteriously, it ends up in Chinese markets. We, the directors, claim, are not responsible for smuggling. We merely produce the product. It is a legal fiction, a convenient illusion, one that allows the company to wash its hands of responsibility even as it reaps the financial rewards. The profits are undeniable. Silvers, once drained endlessly from Britain to China, now flows back in glittering rivers. Chests of bullion arrive in Calcutta, filling the company's coffers. Tea, silk, and porcelain continue to pour into British markets, but now without the painful cost in silvers. The balance has shifted. To the empire, this is victory. To China, it is disaster waiting to unfold. Imagine, for a moment, being a Chinese official walking through Canton at dusk. You pass the warehouses of the Hong merchants, their courtyards stacked high with crates of tea destined for foreign ships. You hear the clink of silver coins exchanged in counting houses. But then, in a quieter alley, you catch the unmistakable scent of opium smoke drifting from behind a closed door. You know the imperial edicts. You know the law. Yet you also know the reality. That behind those doors are men too powerful to challenge, officials too well connected to punish, merchants too rich to ignore. You sigh, adjust your robe, and keep walking. This is how the trade thrives. Not through open defiance, but through silence, complicity, and the lure of profit. Each smuggler, each bribes. Each night boat on the river adds another thread to a vast, invisible web that stretches from the poppy fields of Bengal to the tea houses of London. It is a web spun of smoke and silver, binding nations together in a dangerous embrace. For now, the system seems stable. The merchants grow richer, the smugglers bolder, the officials more corrupt. Opium flows in, silver flows out, tea flows west. But beneath the surface, cracks are forming. The emperor is aware of the growing problem. Advisors whisper warnings of addiction, corruption, and decay. Some officials call for stronger enforcement, others for reform. But the tide is already turning, and the shadow network is too deeply entrenched. The smugglers row on, night after night, their oars dipping silently into the dark waters. The smoke rises in hidden rooms, curling upward like a warning signal. The dangerous plant has found its way into the heart of China, and the consequences are only beginning to unfold. Far to the north of Canton, where smugglers ply their nighttime trades, lies the seat of the Qing Dynasty, Beijing. Here, behind towering red walls and golden roofs that shimmer in the suns, the emperor presides over a realm that stretches farther than the eye can imagine. Courtiers in silk robes glide through echoing halls, their footsteps soft on polished stone floors. The air smells faintly of incense, and every movement is choreographed, every ritual precise. To stand in the Forbidden City is to stand at the very heart of power. For generations, the Qing emperors had regarded their empire as the center of civilization. Foreigners were barbarians at the fringes of the world, tolerated only for their tribute and the silver they brought in trade. China was self-sufficient, wealthy, and vast. What need had it of outside influence? And yet, by the early decades of the 19th century, troubling whispers began to reach the Dragon Throne. Reports from Canton grew more frequent and more alarming. Local officials described a substance flowing into the empire despite imperial bans. A black resin, smoked in pipes, leaving men dazed, weakened, and unable to work. At first, these reports seemed minor, a problem confined to coastal merchants, perhaps a nuisance among a few idle officials. But as the years passed, the warnings grew darker. Soldiers addicted to opium abandoned their posts. Clerks nodded off at their desks. Farmers pawned tools and livestock to buy the drugs. Entire households collapsed under the haze of smoke. The emperor, King, son of the mighty Qianlong, was no fool. He understood the danger posed not only to the health of his people, but to the very stability of the dynasty. An empire built on discipline and order could not afford decay from within. Edicts were issued with firm language. Opium was banned. Its use immoral, its trade criminal. Punishments were prescribed, ranging from fines to exile, even death for repeat offenders. And yet, the problem did not abate. Smugglers grew more daring, merchants more greedy, officials more corrupt. Silver, once flowing steadily into China, began to trickle outward, exchanged for opium rather than tea. The very lifeblood of the empire, its wealth in bullion, was slipping away. This reversal struck at the emperor's deepest fears. For centuries, China had been the creditor of the world, its coffers overflowing. Now, for the first time, it risked becoming a debtor, drained by a substance it had outlawed. Inside the Forbidden City, the court debated furiously. Some ministers urged leniency, arguing that the demand could not be eliminated, only managed. Better, they said, to legalize the trades, regulate it, and collect taxes. Others were horrified at the suggestion. To legitimize opium was to surrender to it, to poison the people with the blessing of the throne. They demanded harsher enforcement, stricter laws, and more vigilant patrols along the coast. The emperor listened, his expression inscrutable, but inside his alarm grew. It was not merely a question of commerce, it was a question of sovereignty. If foreigners could openly defy the laws of the empires, bribing officials and corrupting soldiers, what did that say about the strength of the Qing? If the emperor's word could be ignored in Cantons, might it one day be ignored in Beijing itself? Letters arrived from provincial governors, describing the spread of addiction into the countryside. A farmer too weak to till his fields. A fisherman selling his nets for another dose. Families fractured, communities hollowed out. Even the scholar class, once the proud backbone of the empire, was not immune. Young men preparing for the civil service exams found themselves unable to concentrate, their minds clouded by smokes. The very foundation of the imperial system, the bureaucracy, was under threat. The Qing Emperor, weary from years of rules, took the matter seriously. He renewed bans, ordered harsher punishments, and demanded accountability from his officials. But he also knew the limits of his power. The empire was vast, the coastline long, the smugglers relentless, and within his own ranks, corruption festered. A law on paper meant little if the man charged with enforcing it had already accepted a bribe. In the grand halls of the Forbidden City, discussions turned grim. Some whispered that the foreigners had found China's weakness, not in battle but in temptation. For centuries, China had withstood invasions, rebellions, famines, and floods. But now, a single plant threatened to unravel the strength of the realm. Could it be possible? Could the greatest empire on earth be undone by smoke? Outside the palace walls, the ordinary people sensed little of these debates. Life went on, as it always had. Farmers rose with the sun to tend their crops. Merchants called out in crowded markets. Children played in narrow alleys. Yet even here, the shadow of opium crept closer. A neighbor growing thin and pale. A husband selling family heirlooms. A soldier refusing his duties. The signs were subtle at first, but everywhere they grew. The emperor's alarm was not unfounded. In Canton, the smugglers multiplied. In Bengal, the poppy fields expanded. In London, the East India Company grew fat on silver that once filled China's treasuries. The system had shifted, and the balance tilted dangerously against the Middle Kingdom. The edicts, the punishments, the imperial warnings, all were but paper shields against a tide that surged stronger each year. As the candles flickered low in the emperor's study, he drafted yet another decree. His brush moved with deliberate strokes across the paper, commanding officials to redouble their efforts, to root out corruption, to punish offenders. When he set the brush down, he gazed out into the darkened courtyard. Snow fell softly on the silent roofs of the Forbidden City. Beyond those walls, beyond those gates, his empire stretched across mountains, rivers, and endless plains. But even he could feel it, the creeping weakness, the invisible enemy, spreading one pipe at a time. The dragon throne still stood firm, its rituals intact, its armies vast. Yet beneath its weight, hairline cracks were forming. And in the hush of that winter night, the emperor feared that history might remember him not as a ruler who preserved the empire, but as one who watched helplessly as smoke began to unravel it. Far to the north of Canton, where smugglers ply their nighttime trades, lies the seat of the Qing Dynasty, Beijing. Here, behind towering red walls and golden roofs that shimmer in the sun, the emperor presides over a realm that stretches farther than the eye can imagine. Courtiers in silk robes glide through echoing halls, their footsteps soft on polished stone floors. The air smells faintly of incense, and every movement is choreographed, every ritual precise. To stand in the Forbidden City is to stand at the very heart of power. For generations, the Qing emperors had regarded their empire as the center of civilization. Foreigners were barbarians at the fringes of the world, tolerated only for their tribute and the silver they brought in trade. China was self-sufficient, wealthy, and vast. What need had it of outside influence? And yet, by the early decades of the 19th century, troubling whispers began to reach the Dragon Throne. Reports from Canton grew more frequent and more alarming. Local officials described a substance flowing into the empire despite imperial bans, a black resin, smoked in pipes, leaving men dazed, weakened, and unable to work. At first, these reports seemed minor, a problem confined to coastal merchants, perhaps a nuisance among a few idle officials. But as the years passed, the warnings grew darker. Soldiers addicted to opium abandoned their posts. Clerks nodded off at their desks. Farmers pawned tools and livestock to buy the drugs. Entire households collapsed under the haze of smoke. The Emperor Jaking, son of the mighty Qianlong, was no fool. He understood the danger posed not only to the health of his people, but to the very stability of the dynasties. An empire built on discipline and order could not afford decay from within. Edicts were issued with firm language. Opium was banned, its use immoral, its trade criminal. Punishments were prescribed, ranging from fines to exile, even death for repeat offenders. And yet, the problem did not abate. Smugglers grew more daring, merchants more greedy, officials more corrupt. Silver, once flowing steadily into China, began to trickle outward, exchanged for opium rather than tea. The very lifeblood of the empire, its wealth in bullion, was slipping away. This reversal struck at the emperor's deepest fears. For centuries, China had been the creditor of the world, its coffers overflowing. Now, for the first time, it risked becoming a debtor, drained by a substance it had outlawed. Inside the Forbidden City, the court debated furiously. Some ministers urged leniency, arguing that the demand could not be eliminated, only managed. Better, they said, to legalize the trade, regulate it, and collect taxes. Others were horrified at the suggestion. To legitimize opium was to surrender to it, to poison the people with the blessing of the throne. They demanded harsher enforcement, stricter laws, and more vigilant patrols along the coast. The emperor listened, his expression inscrutable, but inside, his alarm grew. It was not merely a question of commerce. It was a question of sovereignty. If foreigners could openly defy the laws of the empire, bribing officials and corrupting soldiers, what did that say about the strength of the Qing? If the emperor's word could be ignored in Canton, might it one day be ignored in Beijing itself? Letters arrived from provincial governors, describing the spread of addiction into the countryside. A farmer too weak to till his fields, a fisherman selling his nets for another dose. Families fractured, communities hollowed out. Even the scholar class, once the proud backbone of the empire, was not immune. Young men preparing for the civil service exams found themselves unable to concentrate, their minds clouded by smoke. The very foundation of the imperial system, the bureaucracy, was under threat. The Qing emperor, weary from years of rules, took the matter seriously. He renewed bans, ordered harsher punishments, and demanded accountability from his officials. But he also knew the limits of his power. The empire was vast, the coastline long, the smugglers relentless, and within his own ranks, corruption festered. A law on paper meant little. If the man charged with enforcing it had already accepted a bribe. In the grand halls of the Forbidden City, discussions turned grim. Some whispered that the foreigners had found China's weakness, not in battle but in temptation. For centuries, China had withstood invasions, rebellions, famines, and floods. But now, a single plant threatened to unravel the strength of the realm. Could it be possible? Could the greatest empire on earth be undone by smoke? Outside the palace walls, the ordinary people sensed little of these debates. Life went on, as it always has. Farmers rose with the sun to tend their crops. Merchants called out in crowded markets. Children played in narrow alleys. Yet, even here, the shadow of opium crept closer, a neighbor growing thin and pale, a husband selling family heirlooms, a soldier refusing his duties. The signs were subtle at first, but everywhere they grew. The emperor's alarm was not unfounded. In Canton, the smugglers multiplied. In Bengal, the poppy fields expanded. In London, the East India Company grew fat on silver that once filled China's treasuries. The system had shifted, and the balance tilted dangerously against the Middle Kingdom. The edicts, the punishments, the imperial warnings, all were but paper shields against a tide that surged stronger each year. As the candles flickered low in the emperor's study, he drafted yet another decree. His brush moved with deliberate strokes across the papers, commanding officials to redouble their efforts, to root out corruption, to punish offenders. When he set the brush down, he gazed out into the darkened courtyard. Snow fell softly on the silent roofs of the forbidden city. Beyond those walls, beyond those gates, his empire stretched across mountains, rivers, and endless plains. But even he could feel it, the creeping weakness, the invisible enemy, spreading one pipe at a time. The dragon throne still stood firm, its rituals intact, its armies vast. Yet beneath its weight, hairline cracks were forming. And in the hush of that winter night, the emperor feared that history might remember him not as a ruler who preserved the empire, but as one who watched helplessly as smoke began to unravel it. By the early decades of the 19th century, opium had become more than a commodity. It was a clandestine empire in its own right. Though the Qing Emperor had banned its imports, the ban itself merely drove the trade underground, where it flourished. In harbours along the southern coast, a complex network of smugglers, brokers and secret middlemen wove an invisible web, one that stretched from the fields of Bengal to the alleys of Canton. Imagine, if you will, the coastline of southern China at dusk. The sun sinks into the South China Sea, casting the water in deep shades of violet and golds. Junks and sampans bob gently in the waves, their sails lowered, their lanterns flickering like fireflies. At first glance, the harbour seems ordinary. Fishermen mending nets, merchants shouting over crates of dried fish and silk. But beneath the surface, another kind of trade is unfolding. Out beyond the safe reach of imperial patrols, foreign ships anchor just far enough offshore to remain untouchable. They fly no flags, display no names. By day they sit quietly, appearing almost abandoned. But by night, small Chinese boats slip silently toward them, their oars wrapped in cloth to muffle the splash. Crates of opium are lowered carefully into the boats, covered with tarpaulins or hidden under baskets of legitimate goods. Tea, salt, grains. By dawn, these small vessels are back among the crowded harbour, indistinguishable from honest traders. This was the country trade, the euphemism that cloaked the reality of large-scale smuggling, the East India Companies. Constrained by its official charter, avoided direct involvement, but its fingerprints were everywhere. The company produced the opium in Bengal, auctioned it to private merchants, and turned a blind eye to where it went. Those private merchants, often British, but also Americans, Portuguese, and Indian, delivered the opium to China's coast, where the smugglers took over. Everyone along the chain profited, and everyone claimed innocence. Consider the smugglers themselves. Many were poor fishermen or boatmen from Guangdong, men who knew the coastline's inlets and hidden coves better than any official. For them, smuggling was not betrayal, but survival. A single successful trip could earn more than weeks of fishing. Yes, there was risk, imperial patrols, storms, rival gangs, but the rewards were irresistible. And so, night after night, they rode out into the darks, their lives tied to the tides and the currents of an illicit trade. Within the city of Canton, the smuggled opium entered a labyrinth of warehouses and secret rooms. Behind the respectable facades of merchants' shops, Concealed compartments held chests of the drug. Trusted intermediaries moved it further inland, bribing customs officials or hiding it within shipments of rice and silk. The network was resilient, adaptable. If one route was blocked, another opened. If one official grew too rigid, another could be persuaded with silver. The smuggler's web was not purely Chinese, nor purely foreign. It was a collaboration of necessity. British captains relied on Chinese brokers to distribute their products. Chinese brokers relied on British ships to bring it. In between were countless go-betweens, interpreters, clerks, guards, even corrupt officials who issued safe passage documents in exchange for payments. It was a system that thrived precisely because it blurred responsibility. Everyone played a part, but no one claimed to be the heart of it. For the British merchants, smuggling was wrapped in a cloak of moral justification. They argued that if the Chinese wanted opiums, it was not their duty to stop them. They reminded themselves that the emperor's ban was unenforceable. That demand was growing regardless of legality. To them, the trade was business, nothing more. They watched the silver flow back into their coffers and congratulated themselves on restoring balance to the empire's accounts. But on the Chinese side, the effects were impossible to ignore. In coastal towns, entire families became entangled in the trades. Fathers rowed boats by night, sons carried crates by day, mothers prepared food for the smugglers. The money was tempting, but the price was steep. Addiction spread among the very communities profiting from smuggling. A fisherman might earn enough silver to repair his boat, only to spend it on the very opium he carried ashore. The government, aware of the scale of the problem, tried to respond. Patrol ships cruised the Pearl River, searching for suspicious junks. Officials conducted raids, seizing pipes, arresting dealers, making public examples of the most unfortunate smugglers. Yet for every chest seized, dozens slipped through. The smuggler's web was too vast, too nimble. The officials, meanwhile, were too few and too easily swayed. A pouch of silver could make evidence vanish, could turn an arrest into a warning. It is easy, from a modern perspective, to condemn these smugglers as criminals. But one must also see them as people caught in currents larger than themselves. The fisherman who rowed a crate ashore at midnight was not thinking of empire or morality. He was thinking of his hungry children, his leaking roof, the debts he owed to his neighbors. The choice between poverty and profit was no choice at all. In this way, the empire's collapse was woven into the lives of ordinary men and women, thread by thread, trade by trade. By the 1830s, the scale of the smuggling had reached staggering proportions. Thousands of chests of opium entered China each year, funneled through hidden routes and secret deals. The smuggler's web, once fragile, had grown dense and unbreakable. To cut it would require more than local raids. It would require the full force of the state. Yet the Qing court hesitated, torn between fear of foreign reprisals and recognition of the internal crisis. And so the smuggling continued. Night after night, boats slipped through the dark waters unseen by all but the stars. Lanterns flickered on distant decks. Signals passed in silence. In the quiet hours before dawn, crates of opium changed hands. Silver clinked in leather purses. And the great wheel of the trade turned once more. The smuggler's web was invisible to most of the world, but it held within it the seeds of global conflicts. For within its threads lay not only silver and opium, but also the fragile balance of power between two great empires. And soon, that balance would tip. The Forbidden City, at the heart of Beijing, was unlike anywhere else in the empire. Within its crimson walls, time seemed to move differently, slower, more deliberate, as if the rituals of the court could hold back the chaos beyond. The vermilion gates, the golden roofs, the carved marble walkways all proclaimed the majesty of the Qing Dynasty, heirs to centuries of Chinese rules. Yet inside those serene courtyards, anxiety pressed as heavily as the winter fog. By the early 19th century, the Qing emperors faced a paradox. On paper, They ruled the wealthiest nation in the world, a realm stretching thousands of miles, home to hundreds of millions. The mandarins of the bureaucracy, dressed in silk robes embroidered with official rank badges, governed every province with laws refined over centuries. The empire's Confucian ideals emphasized harmony, order, and moral uprightness. The emperor was the son of heaven, charged with maintaining balance between earth and sky. But beyond the palace gates, the balance was faltering. Reports arrived daily from the south, smuggling rampant, officials corrupted, people weakened by smoke. Imperial edicts had forbidden opium repeatedly, first in 1729, again in 1796, and once more in the early 1800s. Each ban declared opium a poison to the body and a threat to the empire. Yet each ban was ignored. The trade only grew, slipping through the cracks of enforcement, seeping into every level of society. Imagine the emperor seated in the hall of mental cultivations, the great throne room where he received his ministers. He wears dragon robes, yellow silk embroidered with clouds and waves, the imperial seal heavy in his hand. Before him kneel the grand councillors, their foreheads touching the cool marble floor. In the silence, the emperor listens to their memorials. Each document, unrolled and read aloud, carries a piece of the empire's pains. One begins in Canton. Opium smoking spreads like wildfire. Students abandon their books. Merchants squander their fortunes. Soldiers lose their strength. Families collapse under the weight of addictions. What edicts will stem this tide? Another councillor adds the silver reserves dwindle. The foreigners drain our wealths, sending only poison in return. Our treasuries weaken and the people suffer. The emperor's brow furrows. For a dynasty steeped in Confucian ideals, the issue was more than economic, it was morals. A ruler was judged not by conquest alone, but by the virtue he instilled in his people. To allow opium was to admit moral failures, to lose the mandate of heaven. Yet the problem resisted every remedy. Punishment had been tried. Smugglers were arrested, their goods burned. In some provinces, addicts were whipped or branded. But enforcement was uneven, undermined by bribery and corruption. Even officials themselves, sworn to uphold the law, sometimes indulged in the very vice they condemned. The emperor could issue edicts from the thrones, but paper decrees carried little weight against silver bribes and smoky temptation. The dilemma was sharpened by politics. Some ministers urged moderation. They argued that since the ban was impossible to enforce, the empire should legalize and tax opiums, turning poison into revenue. Others cried that legalization would betray the empire's moral foundation, surrendering virtue for silver. Between these camps, the emperor hesitated. Consider the loneliness of that hesitation. From the outside, the emperor seemed all-powerful, but in truth, he was encircled by contradictions. To act too harshly risked rebellion from officials and merchants who profited from the trades. To act too leniently risked moral collapse. And behind it all loomed the foreigners, whose ships carried the drug across oceans. Beyond the empire's reach, how does a ruler control what he cannot touch? Inside the forbidden city, life continued with ritual precisions. Eunuchs swept the stone courtyards, palace guards changed shifts at the gates, scholars compiled records in the archives. Yet even within those walls, whispers of opium circulated. Servants spoke of princes who smoked in secret, courtiers who staggered to audiences with clouded eyes. If corruption reached even into the dragon throne's shadows, what hope was there for the provinces? The emperor's dilemma was not merely abstract. It touched the very survival of the dynasties. History weighed heavily on his shoulders. Past dynasties had fallen not only through invasion but through moral decay. From emperors who neglected duty, from officials who lost virtues, from societies hollowed out by indulgence. Every Qing ruler was taught these lessons from childhood. To preside over decline was to risk losing the mandate of heaven, that sacred legitimacy which bound heaven, earth, and throne together. And yet, solutions remained elusive. The bureaucracy produced endless reports, but few answers. Local officials alternated between cracking down and turning a blind eye. Some governors pleaded for reinforcements to patrol the coasts. Others warned that too much force would drive the people into unrest. Every path seemed fraught with peril. Outside the palace walls, the ordinary people felt the tension in quieter ways. A farmer in Guangdong might notice the tax collector demanding more silver than before. The weight of the empire's imbalance passed down to him. A scholar might fail his examination because he spent too many nights lost in smokes. A soldier might stumble in training, his sword heavy, his breath short. These small failures rippled outwards, weakening the empire not with sudden collapse but with slow erosion. And so the emperor sat, day after day, reviewing reports that contradicted each other, weighing punishments that solved little, and pondering decrees that seemed powerless. He was, in many ways, trapped. The throne promised supreme authority, but authority without effective means was a gilded cage. From the hall of mental cultivation, he looked out over the empire and saw a vast sea of troubles. Smugglers on the coasts, corruption in the bureaucracy, addiction in the villages, foreign ships lurking beyond reach. Which wave should he face first? In the stillness of the forbidden city at night, the emperor might have walked through the courtyards, lantern light spilling across the marbles. The air smelled of pine and incense. The halls, silent by day, echoed faintly with the memories of past rulers. Perhaps he looked up at the stars and wondered whether heaven still favored his dynasty. For an emperor of China, such thoughts were not idols. They were questions of fate. The dilemma remained unsolved, but the pressure grew daily. Something would have to change, though no one yet knew how. The empire could not drift forever between prohibition and indulgence. The emperor's choice, when it finally came, would shape not only his dynasty, but the destiny of the nation. In imperial China, words carried weight far heavier than swords. A single brushstroke could shift policy. A carefully argued memorial could shape the fate of millions. The Qing Dynasty's system of government, rooted in Confucian ideals, prized the wisdom of its scholar officials. Selected through grueling examinations that tested their knowledge of the classics, these men were more than bureaucrats. They were the moral compass of the empire. As the opium crisis deepened, it was not only soldiers or smugglers who shaped events, but scholars wielding brushes over silk scrolls. They wrote in elegant calligraphy, their words flowing like rivers across the pages, each stroke deliberate, each argument grounded in centuries of philosophy. These memorials, addressed directly to the emperors, carried a rare authority. They were, in essence, the conscience of the state. Imagine a scholar late at night in his study. The oil lamp flickers, casting long shadows across shelves stacked with ancient texts. His desk is cluttered with brushes, inkstones, and drafts of petitions. He pauses, dips his brush into ink, and begins to write. His hand moves with practiced ease, yet his heart is heavy. He has seen the smoke dens in his province, seen young men slumped against walls, their futures stolen by the pipe. He has heard merchants boast of fortunes made from poison. And he has watched officials, sworn to virtues, take bribes from smugglers. His memorial begins with respect, as tradition demands, "May your majesty, son of heavens, whose wisdom shines upon the world, attend to these humble words." Then, with careful precision, he lays out the crisis. He warns that opium is no ordinary vice, but a corrosive force that weakens body and soul alike. He cites Confucian teachings, reminding the throne that a ruler's duty is to nurture virtue and restrain vice. He invokes histories, recounting dynasties undone by moral decay. His brush does not waver as he writes the most dangerous truth, that unless action is taken, the Qing dynasty itself will falter. Across the empire, similar memorials arrive in Beijing. Some urge mercy, suggesting the legalization and regulation of opium, arguing that the ban is unenforceable, and that controlled trade might restore order. Others demand severity, calling for harsher punishments, greater patrols, even death penalties for dealers and smokers alike. What unites them all is a sense of urgency. The empire is rotting, they warn, and the throne must act before the rot spreads beyond repairs. Among the most famous of these voices was Xu Naiji, a senior official in the Ministry of Justice. In his memorials, Xu argued for a pragmatic approach: legalize opium, he suggested, and place it under state control. By taxing the trades, the empire could replenish its treasury and prevent smuggling. His reasoning was clear-eyed: prohibition had failed, and clinging to it only enriched foreign merchants while draining Chinese silver. In sharp contrast stood Huang Juzi, a censor whose words burned with moral conviction. To Huang, legalization was unthinkable. To tolerate opium, even under regulations, was to betray the empire's moral foundation. He wrote with passion, calling for a total crackdown, not only on smugglers but on officials who indulged or turned blind eyes. He urged the emperor to act with the same severity as past rulers who had crushed corruption and vice. His memorial did not mince words. If the poison is not eradicated, the dynasty will perish. The court debated these conflicting voices. Some ministers nodded at Xu Naiji's pragmatism, others echoed Huang Juezi's fervor. In the forbidden city's echoing halls, scrolls were read aloud, arguments rehearsed, counter-arguments raised. The emperor listened, his face inscrutable. He knew that whichever path he chose would define his reign. To legalize might stabilize the economy, but sacrifice morality. To prohibit might preserve virtue, but risk rebellion and failure. Beyond the palace, the scholars' words stirred societies. Copies of their memorials circulated in tea-houses and academies. Students debated them under lantern lights. Merchants whispered about what policies might come, adjusting their ledgers in anticipation. Even smugglers, hearing rumors of stricter enforcement, grew nervous. In this way, the scholar's pen rippled outwards, touching lives far beyond the study in which it was written. It is worth pausing to consider the courage these men displayed. To criticize the empire's policy was no small matter. A poorly worded memorial could end a career or worse. Yet these scholars wrote anyways, guided by a sense of duty larger than themselves. They were, in a sense, the guardians of the dynasty's conscience, reminding the emperor of his responsibilities not only to power, but to virtue. The memorials also revealed a deeper truth, that the opium crisis was not only an external problem, a matter of foreign merchants and smugglers, but an internal one. It forced the empire to confront questions about its own governance, its own strength, its own morality. Could an empire so vast, so proud, adapt to a challenge it had never faced before? Could Confucian ideals, rooted in harmony and traditions, withstand the corrosive modernity of global trade and foreign greed? The brushed strokes of these scholars did not provide easy answers, but they framed the dilemma with clarity, and clarity, in times of confusion, was itself a form of power. Their words gave shape to the emperor's unease, translated vague anxieties into precise arguments, and demanded that decisions be made. As the 1830s turned toward the 1840s, the debate sharpened. Smuggling grew bolder, silver drained faster, and addictions spread deeper. The memorials piled higher on the emperor's desk, each urging him toward action. And soon, among these voices, one would rise above the rest, a scholar official whose resolve would transform the empire's response. His name was Lin Zexu. Among the many officials who served the Qing Dynasty during its long decline, few names stand out as brightly as Lin Zexu. To his enemies, he was inflexible, uncompromising, even dangerous. To his supporters, he was the very embodiment of virtue, incorruptible, devoted, fearless. In the empire's darkest hour, when indecision and corruption seemed to paralyze the throne, Lin Zexu emerged as the man willing to act. Born in 1785 in Fuzhou, a coastal city in southeastern China, Lin grew up in a modest family of scholars. His father, a school teacher, instilled in him a love for learning and a reverence for Confucian ideals. From a young age, Lin showed unusual brilliance. He rose quickly through the examination system, mastering the classics with precision, his essays marked by clarity and moral convictions. In an age when success depended not only on intellect but on character, Lin shone in both. By the time he entered government service, Lin had already gained a reputation for incorruptibility. While many officials succumbed to the temptations of silver bribes, Lin stood apart. He lived simply, refused lavish gifts, and enforced the law with rigor. His colleagues whispered of his severity, but also of his fairness. He was a man who demanded the same virtue of others that he demanded of himself. When reports of the opium crisis reached the capitals, Lin was among those who raised his voice. But unlike some scholars who wrote cautiously, Lin's words were uncompromising. He declared opium a poison not only to the body, but to the empire itself, a toxin that threatened the very foundation of society. He argued that unless the throne acted decisively, the dynasty would crumble. His memorials caught the emperor's attentions. Where others hesitated, Lin spoke with clarity. Where others offered half measures, Lin demanded absolutes. The emperor, wary of indecisions, found in Lin the determination he lacked elsewhere. In 1838, Lin was appointed imperial commissioner, a position of extraordinary authority, charged with eradicating the opium trade once and for all. The appointment was both an honor and a burden. Lin knew the scale of the challenge. The smuggler's web stretched across the coast, foreign merchants lurked offshore, officials were compromised, and millions of subjects were already addicted. Yet Lin accepted without hesitation. His duty was clear: to save the empire from poisons. Upon arriving in Canton in 1839, Lin set to work immediately. He was not a man of pomp or delay. He toured the city, inspected warehouses, questioned officials, and issued strict new regulations. Opium smokers were given a deadline to surrender their pipes. Dealers were ordered to confess and turn in their stockpiles. Officials who looked the other way were threatened with dismissal, or worse. Lin made it clear this was not another empty decree. This was a crusade. His actions were bold, even ruthless. In just a few months, thousands of addicts entered rehabilitation programs, where they were forced to quit under government supervisions. Hundreds of dealers faced punishment. Officials known to be corrupt were dismissed. The city, long accustomed to lax enforcements, buzzed with nervous energy. Some applauded Lin's determination, others cursed him for disrupting their profits. But no one doubted his resolves. Lin's campaign reached its most dramatic moment when he confronted the foreign merchants directly. For years, they had anchored their ships offshore, selling opium under the cover of night. They had grown rich from the trade, secure in the belief that the Chinese government could do little to stop them. But Lin shattered that illusion. He issued an ultimatum. Every chest of opium in Canton must be surrendered to imperial authorities, or all trade would cease. The merchants resisted at first. Some argued, some stalled, some appealed to their governments for protection. But Lin was unyielding. He blockaded the factories, cut off supplies, and surrounded the foreigners with troops. Days stretched into weeks, tension mounting. Finally, under pressure, the merchants surrendered their stockpiles. In June 1839, Lin oversaw the destruction of more than 20,000 chests of opium, nearly £3 million. The scene was unforgettable. At Humans, near the mouth of the Pearl River, workers dug vast trenches. Opium chests were broken open, their dark contents poured into lime and salt water to render them useless. For days, the mixture frothed and smoked, carrying the stench of destruction across the coast. Soldiers stood guard, officials recorded each chest, and Lin himself supervised, ensuring nothing was spared. To the Chinese people, it was a moment of triumph, a declaration that their empire would no longer bow to poison. To the foreign merchants, however, it was an outrage. The opium represented fortunes, investments, livelihoods. They protested, wrote angry letters, and demanded compensation. When none was offered, they turned to their governments for support. In London, the East India Company and its allies framed the destruction not as justice, but as an insult to British honour and commerce. Voices in Parliament demanded retaliation. Lin's moral clarity, so admired at home, was seen abroad as provocations. Lin himself anticipated this. He knew his actions might spark conflict with foreign powers, but he believed the price was worth paying. Better to fight and preserve the empire's dignity than to submit and watch it decay. His personal motto captured his convictions. If we are to die for righteousness, then so be it. And yet, Lin was not without compassion. He wrote letters to Queen Victoria herself, appealing to her sense of morality. How could Britain allow its merchants to sell poison abroad, he asked, when it banned opium at homes? Did not the laws of heaven and earth demand fairness? His words, eloquent and earnest, never reached the Queen directly, but they remain among the most remarkable documents of the age, a voice of conscience speaking across oceans. In Lin Zexu's, the Qing Dynasty found its most determined defender. He embodied the Confucian ideal of the upright official, willing to sacrifice comforts, reputation, even peace for the sake of virtue. His campaign would ignite the First Opium Wars, a conflict that would reshape the destiny of China. But in that moment, as the smoke of destroyed opium drifted over humans, Lin stood as a symbol of resistance, proof that one man's resolve could still shake an empire. The Pearl River estuary shimmered in the humid heat of June 1839. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries echoing over the broad waters as a crowd gathered along the banks at humans. Soldiers in blue and green uniforms stood in orderly lines, spears and banners raised high. Behind them, local villagers and townsfolk craned their necks to witness an event unlike any they had ever seen. Word had spread across Canton and far beyond. The Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu was about to destroy the foreign poison that had enslaved so many. It was not a secret operation done quietly at night. It was a public spectacle, a deliberate performance meant to declare to the world that China was taking a stand. Nearly 20,000 chests of opium, worth tens of millions of silver dollars, had been seized from foreign merchants. Each chest, weighing about 140 pounds, was now stacked in great wooden towers on the shore. They loomed like fortresses of vice, a grim monument to the scale of the addiction that plagued the empire. Lin Zexu stood at the center of it all, dignified in his official robes. His face was calm, unreadable, yet those who watched sensed the gravity of the moment. For Lin, this was not only a matter of trade but of survival, of morality, sovereignty, and the empire's very soul. At his signals, laborers began their work. Large trenches had been dug into the sand, deep pits lined with stones to hold the poisons. Teams of men pried open the chests with iron tools, splitting the lids, and with each crack came the acrid scent of raw opium. Dark, sticky bricks wrapped in poppy husk and oil were lifted and thrown into the pits. The piles grew higher, the air heavy with the sickly, sweet odor. Once the trenches were filled, the workers poured in water from the river, mixing it with quicklime and coarse salt. As the opium dissolved, the mixture hissed and bubbled, sending up clouds of noxious steams. The lime burned the flesh of those who handled it carelessly, yet still they labored, shoveling, stirring, spreading. The process was slow, deliberate, ritualistic. Nothing was to be left intact. For days the destruction continued, sunrise to sunset, an endless tide of chests cracked, emptied, neutralized, and washed away. Onlookers whispered in awe. To some, it felt like purifications, as if the very land was being cleansed of corruption. The sight of rivers of poison rendered useless filled them with relief and pride. Others looked on with unease, sensing the anger it would provoke among the foreign merchants. But none could deny the power of the moment. The foreigners themselves watched from a distance, forbidden to interfere. To them, it was a catastrophe. Fortunes were dissolving before their eyes. Some stood on ship decks, telescopes in hand, muttering curses. Letters were hastily penned to London and Calcutta, describing the destruction as an intolerable insult, an act of aggression that demanded retaliation. Where the Chinese saw moral justice, the British merchants saw an attack on commerce, on property, on national honor. And still, Lin pressed forward. He understood the symbolism. This was more than the destruction of drugs. It was the assertion of sovereignty. For too long China had endured foreign disrespect, smugglers slipping through its waters, corrupt officials pocketing bribes, ordinary people wasting their lives in smoky dens. With each chest destroyed, Lin sent a message. The Middle Kingdom would no longer be humiliated. The scale of the operation astonished everyone. Day after day, lines of workers emptied chest after chest. By the end, more than 2.6 million pounds of opium had been annihilated, enough to intoxicate millions of people for years. The trenches stank of poppy resin and lime, the mixture turning black and sludgy before being flushed out into the seas. Fishermen downstream complained of the bitter taste of the water, but Lin did not waver. Every trace had to vanish. On the final day, as the last chest was emptied, officials recorded the event in meticulous detail. Clerks noted the number of chests, the precise weight destroyed, the names of those who supervised. Lin himself signed the document with his seal. It was history made official, an act meant not to be forgotten. When the work was finished, Lin addressed his men. His voice, calm but resolute, carried across the beach. "The poison has been destroyed," he said. "May our people be freed from its grips. May heaven and earth bear witness." His words were followed by the crack of ceremonial firecrackers, a symbol of cleansings, of evil driven away by smoke and sound. For the people of Canton, the spectacle was unforgettable. They spoke of it for weeks, describing the mountains of opium, the endless trenches, the strange bubbling smokes. Children asked their parents why the foreigners had brought such poison, and elders shook their heads at the greed of distant lands. In tea houses and markets, Lin Zexu's name was praised as the man who dared to stand up for China's dignity. But across the seas, the story was told very differently. British newspapers described the event with outrage, portraying it as an act of barbarism against British merchants. Politicians debated in Parliament, some condemning the opium trade itself, but many more demanding vengeance for what they saw as a violation of free trade. The destruction at humans, so carefully staged by Lin to demonstrate virtue, instead became the spark for war. Lin himself remained unshaken. In his private writings, he reflected that the empire could not avoid conflict forever. If it was heaven's will that battle should come, then let it come. Better. He believed to fight with honor than to surrender to corruption. He had done his duty, and in his eyes, the burning of opium was a righteous act, regardless of the consequences. The world, however, would not see it so simply. The smoke that rose over Human in 1839 drifted far beyond the Pearl River. It carried with it the seeds of the First Opium Wars, a conflict that would mark the beginning of China's century of humiliation. The flames of destruction lit not only the trenches, but the fuse of history itself. And yet, for those who stood on that beach, watching chest after chest dissolve into nothingness, there was a fleeting sense of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, the empire could cleanse itself of poison and rise anew. For a moment, China stood proud, defiant, and unbroken. The summer of 1839 in Canton ended with the salty tang of lime and opium still lingering in the air. The beaches at Human had been scrubbed clean, the trenches filled, the documents sealed. Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu returned to his offices with a sense of grim satisfaction. He had fulfilled his duty. The poison was gone. His emperor would be pleased. But even as the last chest dissolved into the sea, distant forces were already stirring. On the other side of the globe, far from the crowded harbours of Canton, the events of Human were being retold in a very different light. In London, word of the opium destruction reached the heart of empire by autumn. The news spread quickly, carried by the letters of angry merchants, dispatches from ship captains, and the reports of the East India Company. The language was full of outrage. They spoke not of poison destroyed, but of property seized. Not of an empire's moral stands, but of British honour insulted. Millions lost in a fit of Chinese arrogance. One newspaper declared, the House of Commons buzzed with debate. In the dark panelled chamber, members rose one after another, voices rising in indignations. Some denounced the opium trade itself, arguing that Britain had no right to peddle poison in a foreign land. But these voices were drowned out by others, louder, more numerous, who demanded retaliations. "It is not the opium that matters," cried one parliamentarian, "but the principle. British merchants, British subjects, have been treated as criminals, their property destroyed without compensations. Shall Britain stand by and be mocked by an Oriental despot?" Applause followed. The tone was set. In a world where trade was the lifeblood of empire, an insult to commerce was an insult to national pride. Britain's industrial revolution had filled its ports with ships, its factories with goods, its treasury with wealth. To allow China's defiance to go unanswered was in their minds unthinkable. At Whitehall, ministers debated strategy. Could China's vast and populous truly be brought to heel? Reports suggested the empire was rich but stagnant, its armies large but poorly equipped, its weapons antiquated. Britain, by contrast, had steam-powered ships, modern artillery, and seasoned naval crews. The calculation was simple. A show of force would break Chinese resistance and open its markets to British goods, opium included. Thus, while Lin Zexu believed he had struck a blow to save the empire, the reality was that he had lit a fuse. In London, orders began to take shape. Prepare the navy, mobilize the regiments, secure the routes to Asia. The first Opium War was being born not in the smoke of Chinese trenches, but in the polished halls of Britain's government. Back in Canton, the tension was palpable, even before the first shot was fired. The foreign merchants, though humiliated, did not leave. Their ships still hovered along the coasts, their trade in tea and silk too valuable to abandon. Yet beneath the polite negotiations, anger simmered. They spoke of vengeance in whispers, their eyes always scanning the horizon for the sails of British warships. Lin Zexu, ever vigilant, sensed the storm gatherings. He tightened restrictions on foreign traders, monitored the harbours, and warned his emperor that retaliation might come. Still, he hoped the crisis could be contained. After all, Britain was far away, separated by oceans. Surely, he reasoned, they would think twice before challenging the Middle Kingdom on its own soil. But distance was no longer a barrier in the 19th century. The Royal Navy had transformed the seas into Britain's highway. Steamships cut through currents and winds with ease. To London, the Pearl River was not unreachable, it was merely a journey. Meanwhile, in British India, preparations were already underway. Regiments stationed in Calcutta and Bombay drilled in the humid heat, their red coats bright under the sun. Ships were loaded with cannon and shot, sailors trained for long voyages. Bengal opium, packed in neat wooden chests, continued to flow from the fields to the docks, ready for the markets that Britain believed it had a right to claim. By winter, the first squadrons of British warships were on the move. Black smoke poured from their funnels as they churned across the Indian Ocean, their decks bristling with guns. Sailors sang sea shanties, unaware that they were sailing toward the dawn of a new era in East Asia. In China, life along the coast carried on with uneasy normalcy. Fishermen cast their nets, merchants haggled in markets, scholars read poetry in shaded courtyards. Yet rumours swirled like the monsoon winds. Foreigners, it was said, were plotting revenge. Strange ships, it was whispered, were coming. Ships that belched smoke and moved against the winds. Lin Zexu wrote letter after letter to the emperor, urging caution but also strength. He insisted that China's soldiers could repel any foreign attack. "We are many, they are few," he argued. "If our people stand united, heaven itself will favour us." His confidence was genuine, yet it rested on assumptions that would soon prove tragically misplaced. The emperors, isolated in the palaces of Beijing, read the reports with interest but little urgency. The court still clung to the belief that the Middle Kingdom was unassailable, that barbarians could bark at the gates but never breach them. Lin's warnings were noted, but the dynasty had faced threats before: nomads, rebels, pirates. and survived. Surely this would be no different. And so as 1839 gave way to 1840, two empires moved steadily toward collision. On one side stood Qing China, ancient, proud, and determined to defend its sovereignty. On the other stood Britain, modern, industrial, and hungry for markets. Neither fully understood the other. Neither could back down without losing face. Along the Pearl River, the humid air grew heavier, the silence before the storm pressing on every chest. Canton's merchants whispered in tea houses. Foreign traders lingered uneasily on their balconies. And in the distance, beyond the horizon, the sails of war were already rising. The drumbeats of war had begun. The summer of 1840 dawned hot and heavy along the southern coast of China. The fishermen of the Pearl River estuary woke before sunrise, as they had for generations, poling their boats out into the glittering waters. The air was thick with humidity, cicadas shrilled from the reeds, and the smell of salt and mud drifted from the tidal flats. Yet on this particular morning, something unusual stirred beyond the horizons. The fishermen squinted into the pale dawn light and saw dark shapes moving against the sun, shapes unlike any they had seen before. At first, the villagers thought they were ordinary junks, perhaps merchant ships from Fujian or Guangdong. But as the shapes grew closer, details became clear. These vessels were larger, their hulls darker, their lines unfamiliar. And then came the strangest thing of all, the faint column of black smoke curling into the sky. These were not sailing ships, they were something else. The British Expeditionary Fleet had arrived. To the people of Canton, accustomed to the familiar silhouettes of Chinese junks, and even the occasional European clipper, the sight of steam-powered warships was astonishing. They seemed alive, moving with a steady, mechanical rhythm that ignored wind and tides. Where Chinese vessels strained under canvas sails, these ships glided forward regardless of breeze, their paddles or propellers thrashing the sea into white foam. As the fleet drew closer, the full scale of its power became clear. Dozens of ships stretched across the horizon, frigates, brigs, transports, and the new iron-sided steamers. Their masts bristled with riggings, their decks lined with cannon mouths that gaped like dark eyes. Flags snapped in the wind, red and white crosses fluttering defiantly. To those on shore, it was a sight both mesmerizing and terrifying. The Royal Navy had come not as traders, but as conquerors. News spread rapidly through Canton. Merchants rushed to their shops, whispering of the foreign fleet. Officials sent hurried messengers to Lin Zexu, reporting that the barbarian ships had entered Chinese waters in force. In the markets, people muttered prayers to Guan Yu, the god of war, or lit incense at the local temples, hoping for protection from heavens. Mothers gathered their children, pulling them indoors. The entire city seemed to pause, holding its breath. Lin Zexu, ever composed, received the news with outward calm. He had expected retaliation, though perhaps not on this scale. To him, the smoke-belching vessels were symbols of arrogance, not invincibility. China had faced foreign intruders before and had always driven them back. Still, he ordered immediate precautions. Troops stationed along the riverbanks, cannons inspected, and stockpiles of grain secured. The commissioner believed discipline and resolve could overcome the enemy's machines. Yet those who saw the British ships up close were less certain. Local boatmen reported that the iron-hulled steamers could maneuver with startling speed, turning and advancing against the current as if the river itself obeyed them. Their guns, polished and immense, hinted at destruction on a scale few in Canton could imagine. Whispers spread that these were fire-breathing dragons, monsters of the western seas. Meanwhile, aboard the British fleet, the atmosphere was confident, almost casual. Officers in crisp uniforms strolled the decks, telescopes in hand, studying the hazy coastlines. Sailors scrubbed the planks, polished the brass, and prepared the cannon as if for a grand performance. Many had never seen China before, but they had been briefed. The Qing Empire was wealthy but backward, proud but weak. This campaign, they believed, would be swift and decisive. The Admiral George Eliot, had clear orders secure the coast, protect British merchants, and force China to open its ports to trades. Diplomacy would be offered, but behind it loomed the iron fist of naval power. If Lin Zexu and the Qing court refused to yield, the cannons would speak. For the people of Canton, the first days of the fleet's arrival were strangely quiet. The ships anchored just beyond range, looming like dark fortresses on the water. Their presence alone was a message, a silent threat written against the horizon. Life in the city continued. Boats still ferried goods. Tea houses still served their steaming cups. But the normal rhythm was broken by constant glances toward the river, where foreign masts rose like an iron forest. As days turned into weeks, the tension deepened. Lin Zexu sent envoys to negotiate, demanding that the foreigners respect Chinese law and withdraw. The British commanders replied with polite but firm refusals. Their letters spoke of injured honor and unjust actions, repeating the merchants' demand for compensation for the destroyed opium. It was a conversation destined to fail. Neither side spoke the same language of diplomacy. China emphasizing morality and sovereignty, Britain insisting on commerce and compensation. In the evenings, when the humid air grew heavy and the city lanterns flickered to lights, the people of Canton could see the faint glow of ship lamps far out on the water. Some swore they could hear the clank of engines or the low hiss of steam carried on the night breeze. It was as if a restless beast prowled the edge of their world, waiting for the command to strike. The first exchange of fire came suddenly, almost by accident. A British ship, testing its range, loosed a shot that thundered across the water. The cannonball smashed into an empty stretch of shoreline, sending up a spray of mud and sand. The sound rolled through Canton like distant thunder, rattling windows and shaking hearts. For many residents, it was the first time they had heard the roar of modern naval artillery. Some fell to their knees, certain the gods were angry. Others clenched their fists, vowing revenge. Lin Zexu stood firm. He ordered his cannons along the Pearl River fortified, and commanded the local garrisons to prepare for battles. His faith in China's numbers and righteousness never wavered. Yet in private, some of his officers confessed unease. Their bronze cannon were old, their muskets outdated, their soldiers brave but poorly trained. Against the mechanical monsters anchored offshore, could sheer willpower prevail? The horizon gave no answers. Only the smoke of foreign ships, drifting lazily above the estuaries, offered a hint of what was to come. By midsummer, the people of Canton no longer asked whether war would come. They only asked whence. The stillness broke at dawn. For weeks, the British fleet had hovered beyond the Pearl River estuaries. Their black, smoked funnels and towering masts a constant reminder of the storm waiting offshore. Canton's residents had grown accustomed to the sight, uneasy but strangely numb. Then, one morning in the heat of midsummer 1840s, the silence was shattered by thunder not from the sky, but from the sea. The first cannon shot came from a British frigate testing its range. A plume of smoke blossomed along its side, followed by the thunderous roar that seemed to ripple across the water. A split second later, the cannonball slammed into the Chinese shoreline, sending sand and earth into the air. The sound echoed through the narrow streets of Canton. Merchants rushed from their stalls, mothers pulled children indoors, and soldiers hurried to their posts. The war had begun. On the decks of the Royal Navy, the scene was orderly, almost mechanical. Commands were barked, gun crews sprang into actions, and the ships maneuvered into position with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Sailors worked bare-chested in the humid airs, loading powder and shot with practiced ease. Officers with telescopes measured the range, adjusting the angles of the cannons. The British guns opened again and again, each shot deliberate, each strike landing closer to the Chinese fortifications along the riverbanks. By contrast, the Qing defenders scrambled. Along the coast, old bronze cannons, many mounted on wooden carriages, were dragged into place. Soldiers in cotton uniforms sweated under the weight of powder kegs, their officers shouting orders above the rising din. When the order finally came, the Chinese cannon roared back. Great gouts of smoke enveloped the batteries as iron shot flew toward the British fleet. Some balls splashed harmlessly into the seas, others glanced off the thick timbers of the enemy ships. A few struck true, punching into wooden hulls, but the damage was minimal. From the walls of Canton, spectators watched in awe and fear. They had never seen such a battle. The foreign ships, with their black smoke and iron mouths, seemed like living dragons spitting fire across the water. Each broadside rattled the earth. Each impact sent shivers through the crowd. Some cheered when Chinese guns found their marks. Others wept as British shells exploded near villages and warehouses along the river. Lin Zexu, stationed at his command post, remained composed. He had prepared for this day, reinforcing the river defenses and drilling the troops. He believed in China's righteousness, and righteousness, he thought, would prevail. But as the hours dragged on, the disparity became undeniable. The British guns were faster, more accurate, more devastating. Their ships could maneuver against the tide, their steam engines churning relentlessly. Chinese junks, powered only by sails, struggled even to approach. Midday, the British unleashed a concentrated barrage. Their cannon fire tore into a line of Chinese junks anchored near the shore, splintering hulls and setting sails aflame. Sailors leapt into the water as their vessels burned, clinging to debris as the river swallowed them. On land, fortifications crumbled under the relentless pounding. Walls cracked, towers collapsed, and powder magazines erupted in sudden, blinding fireballs. The defenders fought bravely. Musketeers lined the walls, firing volleys into the smoke. Archers, yes, still armed with bows in some regiments, sent flights of arrows that fluttered uselessly against the wooden sides of British ships. Local villagers joined the struggle, carrying water to douse fires or hauling supplies to the soldiers. But bravery could not make up for the technological gulf. The Qing troops were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and outmatched. By late afternoons, the outcome was clear. The British fleet remained intact, their losses minimal. The Chinese defences lay in ruins, their guns silenced one by one. Smoke drifted across the river like a dark shroud, mingling with the cries of the wounded and the crash of collapsing walls. In Canton itself, panic spread. Families packed what they could carry, fleeing inland along narrow roads. Shops closed their shutters, temples rang their bells in desperate prayers, and rumours flew. Some said the foreigners would sack the city, others that the emperor's armies were on their way. The truth was simpler. Canton stood at the mercy of the Royal Navy. That evening, as the sun sank in a haze of smoke and ash, the British fleet anchored calmly in the estuary. Sailors rested, polishing their cannon, repairing sails, and eating their rations. Officers gathered in wardrooms, writing reports to be sent back to London. The first battle was theirs, the enemy broken. Spirits were high. The mission, they believed, had begun exactly as planned. Lin Zexu, meanwhile, walked the ruined battlements. His robes were stained with dust, his face lined with fatigue, but his resolve was unshaken. He had seen defeat, yes, but not surrender. He spoke quietly to his officers. The empire is vast, and its people many. We have lost a battle, but not the war. His words inspired some, but others looked at the shattered cannons and smouldering junks, and wondered if victory was even possible. The people of Canton drifted to sleep that night under a strange sky. The stars were faint, their light dulled by smokes. The air still smelled of powder and salt. Some dreamed of dragons breathing fire, others of ships that moved without winds. A new reality had arrived, one where the Middle Kingdoms might no longer guaranteed safety. The cannons over Canton had spoken, and their echoes would not fade quickly. The cannon smoke from Canton had barely cleared before the war spread along the southern coasts. Word travelled faster than any horse or messenger could carry. Fishermen whispered it in harbours, merchants passed it through markets, and officials scribbled it into hurried reports destined for Beijing. The story was always the same: the foreign ships were unstoppable. The Royal Navy moved with a strange, unnerving rhythm. To coastal villagers, their approach looked like the glide of predators. Tall masts loomed on the horizon, sails billowing like wings, while from their chimneys rose black pillars of smoke, an omen of fire and irons. Entire towns would watch in silence as the fleet anchored offshore. Then, without warning, the thunder would begin. Chinese defenses were brave but inadequate. At one harbor, defenders wheeled ancient cannons into place. Their bronze mouths had once roared proudly in battles centuries earlier, but time had dulled their edges and weakened their barrels. The men who fired them had little training. When the order came, the cannons erupted with thick smoke, sending iron balls arsing into the seas. Some splashed harmlessly, others struck the waves near the enemy ships. The British response was terrifyingly precise. Their long guns fired in sequence, broadside after broadside, the rhythm like a drumbeat across the waves. Each ball tore into stone ramparts or smashed through the wooden walls of Chinese junks anchored for defense. Explosions blossomed where powder stores were struck, sending showers of sparks into the sky. Soldiers clutched their ears. Civilians fled inland, and fires raged uncontrolled. The imbalance was more than weapons. It was in the way the two sides fought. British ships maneuvered with ease, their steam engines allowing them to move even against tide and wind. Chinese junks, sails straining, could not even chase them. British gunners aimed with instruments and training. Chinese defenders fired by sight and prayers. The difference in accuracy was devastating. Reports piled up on Lin Zexu's desk. At Humans, the Tiger Gate, forts guarding the approach to Canton, walls crumbled under relentless shelling. At Shumens, a wealthy trading port farther up the coast, entire batteries were silenced in a single afternoon. At Ningbo and Joshens, resistance collapsed before it had even begun, the defenders simply overwhelmed by the range and speed of the attackers. For the common peoples, the war felt less like a clash of nations and more like a storm of iron sweeping the coast. Families abandoned fishing boats, afraid they would be mistaken for smugglers and destroyed. Merchants buried their silver in courtyards and fled inland, leaving warehouses to burn. Villagers watched helplessly as temples, houses, and docks vanished in smoke. In Beijing, the reports were read with disbelief. The Diaoguang Emperor paced his palace halls, demanding answers from his ministers. How could mere barbarians wreak such havoc upon the empire of 10,000 generations? Courtiers argued endlessly. Some urged negotiations, warning that the foreigners' weapons were beyond comparison. Others insisted that with more troops and more courage, victory was still possible. Few dared speak the truth, that China's military was centuries behind. Meanwhile, the British advanced with confidence. Officers wrote letters home describing the war almost casually, as though it were a series of exercises. They marveled at the ease with which Chinese defenses crumbled, but also at the wealth of the cities they encountered. One captain described warehouses filled with tea bricks, silks, and porcelain finer than anything in Europe. Another noted the vast crowds of civilians who watched battles from the hillsides, unable to intervene, powerless in their own lands. Among the Chinese defenders, morale began to fracture. Some soldiers deserted their posts, terrified by the foreigners' fire ships. Others fought stubbornly, refusing to abandon their cannons even as walls fell around them. In one coastal village, a group of peasants armed with bamboo spears and farm tools confronted a landing party of British Marines. They were swept aside in minutes, but their courage was whispered about long afterward. Yet courage could not change the outcome. By 1841, British control of the southern coastline was nearly complete. With each victory, they tightened their grip on China's trade routes, threatening to choke off the empire's lifeblood. Opium continued to pour in, silver continued to drain out, and now Chinese goods themselves were at risk of being plundered. In Canton, the people lived in constant fear. Every distant boom of cannon sent shutters slamming closed. Merchants avoided the harbour, fearing another bombardment. Rumours swirled. Some claimed the foreigners had magic that made them invulnerable. Others whispered that traitors within the empire were secretly helping them. Trust between officials and citizens frayed. Lin Zexu refused to yield. He wrote to the emperor urging resistance, insisting that the empire's vast manpower could yet overwhelm the foreigners if only properly organized. He believed that moral strength mattered more than technology, that the righteousness of China's cause would carry the day. But his pleas were overshadowed by court intrigue, where rivals accused him of arrogance and blamed him for provoking the war in the first place. The British, meanwhile, made plans for their next step. Canton was battered but not yet fully under control. The key lay farther north, Nanjing, the great city along the Yangtze River. If they could sail upriver and threaten the heartland, the emperor himself would have no choice but to negotiate. The war, once a dispute over opium, was becoming something much larger. A struggle for the future of China itself. That night, along the battered shores of the Pearl River, villagers gathered quietly. The fires of battle had died down, replaced by the soft hum of crickets and the gentle lapping of water against blackened docks. Elders spoke in hushed tones, remembering tales of past invasions, Mongols and Manchus and pirates. Always the Middle Kingdom had endured. But as the stars wheeled silently above, many wondered if this time would be different. If the empire was facing not just a foreign foe, but a new world it could no longer command. By the spring of 1841, the Qing Empire's defences were unravelling like a frayed tapestries. The defeats along the southern coast had shaken confidence, not only in the garrisons, but in the court itself. Each new report from the provinces carried the same refrain: the enemy's ships were unstoppable, their cannons unanswerable, their soldiers disciplined and unyielding. In the bustling city of Canton, hope was thinning. The once thriving markets, filled with chatter and silver, now felt subdued. Merchants who had traded tea and silk with pride whispered about lost fortunes. Opium dens still glowed with lamplight, but even there the haze of smoke could not blot out the sound of distant cannon fires. Families packed their belongings into bundles, ready to flee inland should the foreign fleets return. The Qing military struggled to adapt. Reinforcements were dispatched from the interior, but they arrived poorly trained, ill-equipped, and bewildered by the enemy they faced, as many had never even seen the sea before. Soldiers accustomed to fighting bandits in the mountains found themselves staring at vast wooden fortresses floating on the water, bristling with iron mouths that spat fire. Some dropped their weapons in terror. At the same time, the chain of command faltered. Local governors bickered with generals, generals argued with admirals, and the imperial court sent contradictory orders. One day they demanded an uncompromising defense, the next they hinted at negotiation. Resources were stretched thin, powder was scarce, cannonballs mismatched to their barrels, muskets rusted and unreliable. Lin Zexu, still governor-general in Canton, tried to hold the lines. He inspected forts, rallied troops, and reminded them of their sacred duty to defend the empire. His presence inspired many, but morale could not be built from spirit alone. Time after time, British broadsides reduced strongholds to rubble in hours. Lin's reports to the emperor became increasingly desperate, urging reform and modernizations. But they fell on ears more concerned with preserving dignity than confronting reality. In Beijing, the Daoguang emperor raged at the humiliations. He struck the table with his hand, demanding why his vast empire could not defeat a handful of ships from across the sea. Ministers bowed low, offering excuses. Some blamed corrupt local officials for failing to prepare. Others accused Lin Zexu of overstepping his authority by destroying the opium trade without adequate military strength. Few dared admit the deeper truth, that the Qing Empire had not kept pace with the world beyond its borders. Meanwhile, the British pressed their advantage. Having secured dominance in Canton, they sailed farther north, striking at coastal cities almost at will. Ningbo fell with little resistance, its defenses collapsing after a short bombardment. The strategic island of Joshan was occupied, its inhabitants watching helplessly as Union Jacks rose above their forts. To the British officers, it was a campaign unfolding with alarming ease. For the Chinese people, the collapse of resistance was not measured in maps or strategies, but in daily life. Villages along the coast emptied as families fled inland, abandoning ancestral homes to the invaders. Farmers in the fields paused their ploughing at the distant sound of cannons, wondering if their crops would survive the summer. Traders saw caravans disrupted, roads deserted, markets bare. What had begun as a dispute over opium now felt like a storm swallowing the empire whole. Amid the despair, stories of courage still flickered. At one river fort, a small garrison of soldiers fought to the last man, holding off British Marines until the walls collapsed around them. In a fishing village, women carried water and food to soldiers under fire, refusing to abandon their homes. Such moments lifted hearts briefly, but they could not change the broader tide. By mid-1841, the Qing court made a painful decision. Lin Zexu was dismissed. His steadfast resistance, once praised, was now blamed for bringing calamity. The emperor, swayed by rival factions, sent an envoy named Qushan to negotiate with the foreigners. It was a quiet admission that the empire could not win by force. Lin, disgraced, left Canton in sorrow, his head held high but his heart heavy. He had fought with all his strength, but the empire was not ready to follow him. The negotiations that followed were strained. The British, emboldened by victory, demanded territorial concessions, indemnities in silver, and the legalization of opium. The Qing envoys stalled, promising some things, refusing others, hoping to buy time. But each delay brought new bombardments, new humiliations. The British simply advanced further, knowing that resistance was crumbling. In the countryside, ordinary people looked to Beijing for answers, but none came. The emperor's decrees were vague, full of lofty words about heaven's mandate and the empire's dignity. Yet the dignity of the people was eroding. Fathers sold heirlooms to buy safety, sons joined militias that dissolved after a single clash, mothers carried children across endless roads, hoping to find villages untouched by war. The collapse of resistance was not a single moment, not one battle lost, but a slow unraveling. Each fort abandoned, each garrison routed, each treaty signed chipped away at the illusion of invincibility that had cloaked the Qing Dynasty for centuries. For generations, the empire had called itself the Middle Kingdom, the center of the world. Now, its people whispered that the world beyond had grown stronger and the Middle Kingdom weaker. One evening in Ningbo, as the Union Jack fluttered above the captured cities, a British officer stood on the ramparts and gazed inland. Beyond the hills lay the vastness of China, fields stretching endlessly, rivers winding toward mountains. He marveled at the sheer scale of it. How strange, he remarked to a fellow officer, that a nation so vast, so ancient, can crumble before us like this. The officer could not know the depth of the wound being inflicted. To the Chinese people, the collapse of resistance was not only military, it was spiritual. The empire's self-image, its belief in heaven's favor, its centuries-old sense of superiority, all were shaken. The sound of cannons had pierced not just walls and ships, but the very soul of a civilization. By the summer of 1842, the war had dragged on for more than 2 years, leaving behind a coastline scarred by bombardment and a people weary of flight and fear. The Qing court could no longer deny what had become obvious to every farmer, fisherman, and merchant. The empire's armies could not expel the British. Every attempt to resist had ended in flames. The decisive blow came when the British fleet sailed up the mighty Yangtze River. Steam power carried them against the currents, past towns and villages whose people stood in silence, watching foreign warships glide across waters that had never seen such vessels before. They bypassed coastal defenses entirely, sailing deep into China's heartland, their cannons ready to strike. When the fleet anchored off Nanjing, the ancient southern capital, Panic spread like wildfire. Nanjing was no mere port. It was a symbol of dynasties past, a city of scholars, poets, and emperors. To threaten it was to threaten the empire's very soul. Refugees flooded into the countryside, while officials scrambled to protect archives, treasures, and family lineages. The city's walls, strong in appearance, were no match for the British guns. The Daoguang Emperor, far away in Beijing, could no longer ignore reality. His ministers pressed him with a simple truth: the dynasty stood on the brink of collapse. If Nanjing fell, the foreigners might march farther north, perhaps even to the capital itself. Reluctantly, he authorized his envoys to negotiate peace. The order was clear: end the war, whatever the costs. Thus began the talks aboard a British warship anchored near Nanjing. The scene was stark. On one side sat the British officers and diplomats, their uniforms crisp, their demands prepared. On the other sat the Qing envoys, their silk robes heavy in the summer heats, their faces lined with exhaustion. The imbalance of power was visible in every detail, the setting chosen by the victors, the weapons bristling outside the cabin, the knowledge that refusal meant further devastation. The British presented their terms. First, the cession of territory, the island of Hong Kong, to serve as a permanent base for trade. Second, a massive indemnity, 21 million silver dollars, to cover the cost of the war. Third, the opening of 5 ports, Canton, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, where foreigners could trade freely, live in designated quarters, and conduct business without interference. Fourth, equal diplomatic relations, meaning Britain would no longer send tribute as a vassal state, but deal with China as an equal power. And though not explicitly written, the trade in opium, the very cause of the war, would continue unchecked. The Chinese envoys protested. They argued, they pleaded, they tried to soften the terms. But each objection was met with the same quiet reminder: British guns pointed at Nanjing. The choice was not between honor and humiliation, but between humiliation and ruin. At last, worn down by the weight of inevitability, the envoys affixed their seals. On August 29, 1842, the Treaty of Nanjing was signed. The ink had barely dried before news rippled across China. It was the first of what would come to be called the unequal treaties. Agreements imposed under threat of force, binding only one side. For the Qing Dynasty, it was a moment of irreversible decline. The immediate consequences were felt in the ports. In Shanghai, foreign merchants arrived with eagerness, establishing warehouses and settlements along the Bund. In Canton, the old restrictions collapsed, and British traders strode through the streets with new confidence. The silver indemnity drained the empire's treasuries, forcing new taxes upon already suffering peasants. And in Hong Kong, a rocky island that had once seemed insignificant, the Union Jack rose above a new colonial possession, destined to grow into one of the greatest trading hubs of the modern world. But beyond material loss, the treaty inflicted a deeper wound: the shattering of pride. For centuries, China had seen itself as the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization, heaven's chosen realm. Now it was forced to treat a foreign kingdom as equal, even superior. Scholars wrote bitter essays, officials wept in private, and ordinary people whispered that heaven had turned its face away. In Beijing, the Daoguang Emperor received the treaty with grim silence. He signed decrees implementing its terms, but in his private chambers, he lamented the shame. He had inherited an empire vast and ancient, yet under his reign it had been humbled by men from across the sea. He could not bring himself to mention the word defeat. Instead, he ordered his scribes to phrase the announcements carefully, speaking of settled peace and renewed harmony. But no words could disguise the truth. Among the British, the treaty was celebrated. Newspapers in London proclaimed victory, praising the courage of sailors and the wisdom of the negotiators. Merchants exulted at the new opportunities, imagining fortunes to be made in silk, porcelain, and especially tea. Yet even in their triumph, a few voices wondered what had been unleashed. One officer, writing in his journal, reflected, We have humbled an empire, yet I cannot help but pity it. Their pride is broken, and with it, perhaps, their spirit. For the Chinese people, life went on, but beneath the surface, something had changed. In tea houses and marketplaces, people spoke quietly of the treaty, of Hong Kong lost, of ports opened, of silver drained. Some shrugged, saying the empire was too vast to be undone by one war. Others feared it was only the beginning. As night fell over Nanjing, the ink on the treaty still fresh, lanterns flickered along the riverbanks. The Yangtze flowed quietly, as it had for thousands of years, carrying boats and dreams through the heart of China. Yet, for those who signed that day, the river seemed different, no longer a lifeline, but a boundary crossed by foreign ships, carrying with them a new world order. The Treaty of Nanjing was more than an end to war. It was the start of a century of humiliations, a long unraveling of an empire that had once believed itself eternal. And though the cannons had fallen silent, their echoes lingered in every heart. The Treaty of Nanjing brought peace, but it was a peace heavy with sorrow. The cannons fell silent, yet the echoes of defeat reverberated across the land. China had lost not just battles and territory, but something far more fragile, its sense of invincibility. The empire that once claimed to be the Middle Kingdom, the center of the world, now found itself treated as weak and vulnerable. In Beijing, the Daoguang Emperor received reports of the treaty's enforcement with a grim heart. Silver was dispatched to meet the indemnity payments. Governors were instructed to prepare the ports for foreign trade. Hong Kong was handed over. Each act felt like a small surrender, and yet each was unavoidable. Courtiers tried to mask the shame with ritual and rhetoric, insisting that the dynasty's dignity remained intact, but even they whispered behind closed doors. For ordinary people, the changes came swiftly. In Canton, foreigners established trading compounds not just in the narrow district once designated for them, but throughout the city. British merchants walked the streets with newfound confidence, guarded by treaties that ensured their safety. In Shanghai, warehouses sprouted along the riverbank, their walls filled with tea, silk, and porcelain. Sailors from distant lands mingled in markets where Chinese voices once dominated. The opium trade, far from being suppressed, flourished. With foreign ships granted greater access, smugglers no longer needed to lurk in shadows. Opium flowed into the ports and from there into the countryside. Dens multiplied, hidden behind paper doors and bamboo screens. Within them, men lay sprawled on wooden platforms, pipes in hand, their lives drifting into haze. What Lin Zexu had once fought so fiercely to stop now spread unchecked, a quiet poison undermining the empire's strength. In the villages, resentment grew. Taxes rose to pay the indemnities, falling hardest on farmers already burdened by floods and poor harvests. They grumbled that while the emperor lived in palaces and the foreigners grew rich, their children went hungry. Secret societies whispered of rebellion, weaving tales of divine justice and heavenly kings who would sweep away corruption. In the south, rumors spread of a visionary named Hong Xiuquan, who spoke of a new heavenly order. The seeds of future uprisings were being sown in the soil of humiliation. Scholars, too, felt the wound deeply. For centuries, they had written of China's superiority, its culture unmatched, its wisdom unassailable. Now, they faced a harsh contradiction. Some tried to explain away the defeat as heaven's punishment for moral decay. Others argued that China must learn from the barbarians, study their weapons, adopt their technologies. A few bolder still called for radical reform, but the imperial court was cautious, fearful of change that might erode its authority. So the debates remained largely academic while the empire drifted. In the occupied ports, daily life took on a strange duality. Foreign merchants celebrated their success, raising glasses of wine in grand halls, while just beyond the walls Chinese laborers bent under heavy loads, earning meager wages. The sight of foreign flags flying in Chinese cities was jarring, a constant reminder of defeat. Yet some locals adapted quickly, finding opportunity in translation work, trade partnerships, or supplying the new settlements. For a few, the treaty brought wealth. For many, it brought resentment. Hong Kong, ceded outright, began its transformation. Once a cluster of fishing villages, it now echoed with hammers and saws as docks, warehouses and administrative buildings rose. Streets were laid out, markets opened, and ships from across the world crowded its harbour. The Union Jack fluttered above Victoria Peaks, a symbol that the foreigners had not merely visited China but claimed part of it. To many Chinese, this was the most bitter loss of all. The psychological toll was immense. In towns and villages, people spoke of the foreigners with a mix of fear and contempt. They called them young Gazi, foreign devils, yet admitted quietly that their guns were unmatched. Children grew up hearing stories of burning junks, collapsing forts, and silver flowing out of the empire like water from a broken jar. A generation was being shaped by defeat. The Qing Dynasty itself was shaken. Factions at court blamed one another. Some denounced Lin Zexu as reckless, others accused Qishan of weakness in negotiation. The emperor alternated between fury and despair, retreating deeper into his palaces. Officials continued to wear their embroidered robes, bow in ritual, and speak of heaven's mandate. But beneath the surface, cracks widened. Abroad, the world watched with interest. Western powers took note of Britain's victories. If one European nation could force open China's gates, why not others? Soon American, French, and even Russian envoys knocked at the empire's doors, demanding their own treaties, their own privileges. The most favored nation clauses ensured that each new concession extended to all, eroding sovereignty further. The century of humiliation, though not yet named, had begun. For the first time in living memories, China was no longer master of its destiny. It had entered a world of unequal treaties, foreign settlements, and encroaching powers. Yet life, in its stubborn way, continued. Farmers still tilled their fields, children still studied their classics, poets still wrote of moonlight on rivers. The empire was wounded, but not yet dead. Some whispered of renewal, others of vengeance. The shadows of rebellion grew longer, stretching toward a future where the Qing dynasty would face not just foreign fleets, but its own people rising in anger. That night in Nanjing, months after the treaty's signing, lanterns bobbed along the river. The water reflected their flickering light, carrying it gently downstream. The city seemed peaceful, but in the hearts of its peoples, unease lingered. The war was over, yet the true struggle, the struggle for China's soul, was only beginning. History is filled with battles, treaties and rulers whose names fade with time. Yet sometimes, the smallest things leave the deepest scars. Not a cannon, nor a crown, but a flower. The poppy, with its delicate red petals and hidden resin, had grown for centuries in faraway fields. From its sap came dreams, forgetfulness, and escape. And from its smoke came one of the most painful chapters in China's long stories. When the Qing Empire faced its first defeats, no one could have imagined the ripple that would follow. The Treaty of Nanjing seemed at first a bitter but isolated wound, a single misstep corrected by silver and territory. But in reality, it was the opening of a floodgate. One treaty led to another, one humiliation invited the next. The balance that had once allowed the empire to sit above the world was overturned, and the dragon that had once slept peacefully now struggled to keep its wings intact. The echo of opium lingered far beyond the battlefields. In coastal cities, smoke still curled from the mouths of pipes wending through narrow alleys and perfumed rooms. Behind painted screens, men slipped into slumber, unaware of time's passage. Families mourned as fathers, sons, and brothers lost themselves in haze. What began as a luxury indulgence became a national sickness. The empire, already pressed by indemnities and foreign demands, now faced weakness from within. In the countryside, farmers bore the heaviest weight. They tilled their fields under heavier taxes, sent their grain to markets flooded with foreign goods, and watched their sons vanish into opium dens. Whispered curses rose against both court and foreigner alike. To some, the dynasty had lost heaven's favor. To others, the world itself had turned upside down. Out of this despair came rebellion, the Taiping, the Neon, and countless smaller uprisings. The land cracked with unrest, as if the earth itself protested the weight of humiliation. Foreign flags multiplied along China's shores. British gunboats had been first, but soon others followed. The French arrived, the Americans, the Russians, each demanding their own share of the empire's markets. They built churches, warehouses, banks, and embassies in cities once guarded jealously by imperial law. In Shanghai, whole districts became foreign concessions, where Chinese officials held no power. To walk from one street to another was to step into a different world, one where Western laws, languages, and currencies ruled. For the Qing, each concession chipped away at sovereignty. The court clung to its rituals, still performing ceremonies in the forbidden city as if nothing had changed. But beyond the vermilion walls, the empire was slipping. Ministers debated reform but feared instability. Scholars urged the study of Western science, while others argued that true strength lay in returning to Confucian virtue. The empire wavered, torn between past and present, unable to decide which path might restore dignity. And yet, in the quiet spaces between suffering, resilience endured. Families passed on traditions honoring ancestors, tending gardens, reciting poetry by candlelight. China's culture, so deep and enduring, remained unbroken even as its politics faltered. Where opium smoke dulled lives, stories and songs still kept the flame of memory alive. The people endured, as they always had, waiting for the day the tides might shift once again. The Opium Wars were not merely about trade or treaties. They were about imbalance, the clash between an empire that believed itself eternal and a world rushing into new machines, new markets, new ambitions. Britain sought silver, found resistance, and unleashed opium. China sought to guard its traditions, found invasions, and was forced to bend. The story is not one of villains and heroes alone, but of pride, desperation, and the tragic weight of choices. When later generations spoke of this time, they called it the century of humiliation, not just because of the wars, but because of what they symbolized: a proud empire brought low not by another great civilization, but by the lure of smoke and the thunder of ships. It was a reminder that power, once taken for granted, can dissolve in an instant. And yet, history moves in cycles. The dragon does not sleep forever. From these ashes would one day rise new movements, new visions of China's place in the world. Reformers, revolutionaries, and dreamers would take the memory of this humiliation and turn it into fuel. The pain of the opium years became not just a scar, but a lesson, one carried across generations. Tonight, as you close your eyes and let the story fade, imagine again that quiet harbor in Canton at the dawn of the 19th century. The mist curls over the river, ships bob gently at anchor, merchants haggle, sailors laugh, and somewhere in the distance, an opium pipe is lit, its smoke twisting upward like a warning too easily ignored. No one then could have guessed how much would change, how a single flower could bring an empire to its knees. History, after all, often turns not on the clash of empires alone, but on the smallest of things. A seed in the soil, a choice in the moment, a puff of smoke drifting into the night air. The echoes of opium are still with us, woven into the fabric of China's modern identities. They whisper of sorrow, of endurance, and of renewal. And as the lanterns fade and the river darkens, one truth lingers like a shadow across the centuries, that even the greatest empire can fall, not with a roar, but with a sigh carried on smoke.